The world began not with light, but with an aching void. There was no sound, no warmth, only an endless expanse of silence and shadow. Between the frozen wastes of Nibelheim and the blistering fires of Muspelheim lay Ginnungagap, a yawning chasm where nothing lived and nothing yet dreamed. In this place of nothingness, where even time held its breath, the seeds of all things stirred. From the icy rivers of Nibelheim flowed venomous streams that crept toward the edges of the abyss. And from Muspelheim, where fire danced wild and unyielding, came sparks carried by feral winds. When the two forces met in the void, chaos roared to life. Ice groaned and cracked as it melted, birthing the first waters. Fire hissed and recoiled, its defiance shaping something new. Amid the clash of heat and cold, Ymir emerged, the first of the giants, his body a raw creation of contradiction. He breathed frost and fire, his vast limbs trembling with every step as if the universe itself rebelled against his existence. Ymir was not alone for long. From the melting ice came a cow named Audhumla, her form strange and ancient. She fed Ymir with rivers of milk that poured from her swollen udders, while she herself licked at the salty ice around her. With each stroke of her tongue, she unearthed another form, Buri, the ancestor of the gods, whose blood carried the promise of something greater than chaos. From Buri came his son, Bor, and from Bor's union with the giantess Bestla were born three brothers who would change everything: Odin, Vili, and Ve. These brothers looked upon Ymir and his kin with both fear and fury. The giants multiplied like shadows in twilight, spreading across Ginnungagap, their chaotic nature threatening to overwhelm all. Odin, driven by the fire of purpose, led his brothers in an act so brutal it would echo through eternity. They slew Ymir. The giant's blood gushed forth in torrents, drowning most of his kin. His flesh became the earth, his bones the mountains, and his teeth the stones. From his skull, they shaped the sky, and his brains were cast into the air to form the clouds. But it was his blood, thick and red as molten iron, that gave rise to something extraordinary. It surged into the rivers and oceans, carrying with it fragments of Ymir's chaotic power. The Rhine, vast and ancient, was born of this blood, a river of life and death, of power and peril. Its waters glistened with a strange glow, for buried within its depths lay a treasure unlike any other. The treasure did not appear as gold or jewels at first. It was raw, unshaped energy, forged by the cosmic forces that had birthed the world. But when the first hands reached into the Rhine to claim it, it transformed. The Nibelung treasure shimmered, taking on the form of glittering gold that could tempt even the purest heart. Its beauty was blinding, its allure irresistible. Yet, it was no gift. The treasure carried the essence of Ymir's chaos, a curse embedded deep within it. Whoever possessed it would find their heart darkened, their soul twisted by greed and power. The curse whispered to those who held the gold, promising dominion over all yet demanding a price no one could truly pay. The first to claim it was Alberich, a dwarf of cunning and cruelty. He shaped the gold into a ring, binding its power to his will. With it, he ruled his kin, bending them to his desires. Yet, the curse gnawed at him, turning his victories hollow. His laughter rang out across the caverns of the Nibelungs, but it was a laughter edged with madness. The gods knew of the treasure, and they feared it. Odin, who had sacrificed his eye for wisdom, saw what the ring could do. He saw the wars it would ignite, the blood it would spill, and the sorrow it would weave into the fabric of the world. Yet even Odin, mighty as he was, dared not destroy it. The curse was alive, bound to the essence of creation itself. To erase it would be to unravel everything. The Rhine, ancient and knowing, held the treasure close, as though mourning what it had birthed. Its waters surged and receded, whispering secrets to those who dared listen. Many came seeking the gold, drawn by tales of its power, but few returned. The river claimed them, their bodies lost to its depths, their ambitions drowned in its icy embrace. The treasure remained, its glow flickering like a restless heart, waiting for the next hand to reach for it. The Nibelung hoard became more than gold, it became legend. A thing spoken of in hushed tones by firelight, its name heavy with awe and fear. Parents warned their children of the curse, telling them to shun greed and temptation, yet their own eyes gleamed when the tale reached the part about the ring. Even the gods, for all their wisdom, could not resist its pull. It was said that Odin himself would gaze at the Rhine from Hlidskjalf, his high seat, his single eye filled with longing and dread. And so, the treasure slept, wrapped in the murmur of the Rhine's waters, its curse growing heavier with each passing age. It waited, silent and patient, for the day it would rise again to claim another soul. It knew, as all cursed things do, that the greed in men's hearts would never fade. It would only grow stronger, darker, more desperate. But even as the Rhine flowed, carrying the weight of its burden, far away in the halls of men and giants, forces began to stir. Forces that would bring the cursed gold into a new age, an age of heroes and betrayal, of bloodshed and vengeance. Forces that would awaken the treasure once more. The Nibelungs were not born of peace. Their name was forged in shadow, where blood and ambition flowed like rivers. Long before they became rulers of treasure and power, they were wanderers, a scattered people bound by hunger and desperation. Their lives were cold, harsh, and quiet, their songs drowned by the endless howl of the wind. But within them burned a fire, a relentless yearning for more, for something greater than mere survival. It was this hunger that caught the attention of the gods. Odin watched them first. His gaze pierced the veil of mortal lives, searching for the ones who might shape the world as much as it shaped them. He saw their struggles, their cunning, and their pride. They were small in stature, compared to the towering giants or the radiant gods, but their will was sharper than any blade. Odin knew what they could become, but he also knew the cost. One moonless night, as frost coated the earth in silence, the first ancestor of the Nibelungs, a man named Valdric, knelt before an altar of black stone. The air was heavy, suffocating, as though the gods themselves leaned close to hear his words. His voice was raw, trembling, as he begged, not for food, not for shelter, but for power. He spoke of the giants who mocked his people, of the gods who stood silent in their suffering. His words were not the words of a man asking for mercy. They were the demands of someone who refused to be ignored. The shadows around him shifted, alive with something ancient and watching. The fire in the altar flared, not golden but a deep, unholy red. A voice filled the silence, not booming, but soft and cold, like a dagger pressed against the skin. It was Loki. The trickster, the father of lies, the one who danced on the edge of chaos. He promised Valdric what he sought, strength, wealth, the means to rise above all others. But his promises came wrapped in riddles and venom. To seal this pact, Loki demanded blood, not of an enemy, but of kin. Valdric hesitated, his hands trembling as he gripped the blade. He turned toward his younger brother, Arden, who had followed him to the altar, unaware of the price they might pay. Arden's eyes widened as realization struck, but he did not run. He stood tall, his face pale but his gaze steady. "If this is what it takes," Arden said, his voice steady and hollow, "then do it." The blade fell, and with it, the first bond of the Nibelungs was forged. Loki laughed as the blood soaked into the earth, binding their fate to his will. From that night, Valdric became something more than a man. His strength grew, his cunning sharpened, and his name became a whispered terror among their enemies. The Nibelungs rose, and with them, the legend of their dynasty began. Generations passed, each more ruthless than the last. The Nibelungs grew wealthy, but their wealth was not of gold or jewels, it was power. They bent others to their will, their cunning minds turning enemies into pawns. But no matter how much they gained, it was never enough. There was always something more, something out of reach. One fateful day, their paths crossed with Alberich, the dwarf who held the cursed treasure of the Rhine. The Nibelungs had heard whispers of the treasure, how it could grant its master dominion over all. Alberich guarded it fiercely, his heart twisted by the curse, his eyes hollow from the weight of its power. He trusted no one, for the curse had poisoned his soul. But the Nibelungs were not giants who sought to take the treasure by force, nor were they gods who wielded lightning and fire. They were mortal men and women, bound by the frailty of flesh, but armed with a sharper weapon, their words. They came to Alberich, not as conquerors, but as allies. They spoke of shared pain, of enemies who sought to destroy them both. Alberich hesitated. For the first time in years, he felt something other than suspicion. He saw in the Nibelungs a reflection of his own desperation, his own hunger for more. Slowly, he agreed to let them near the treasure. But the Nibelungs had no intention of sharing its power. On a night when the stars were hidden, Valdrix descended. Sigmar crept into Alberich's lair. The dwarf slept uneasily, clutching the golden ring as though it might vanish if he loosened his grip. Sigmar moved with the silence of a shadow, his hand steady as he reached for the treasure. But the moment his fingers brushed the gold, Alberich's eyes snapped open. The two clashed in a battle of fury and deceit, their cries echoing through the cavern. Alberich fought with the ferocity of someone who had nothing else, but Sigmar fought with the fire of someone who had everything to gain. In the end, Alberich fell, his broken body collapsing beside the treasure he had guarded for so long. Sigmar held the ring aloft, its golden surface glinting even in the dim light. His heart raced as he felt its power coursing through him. But as he looked down at Alberich's lifeless form, he felt something cold and sharp twist in his chest. The treasure was his, but it was not what he had imagined. Its glow was beautiful, but it carried a weight that pressed down on him like an iron chain. The Nibelungs now held the hoard, but with it came the curse. They did not speak of Alberich's warning, whispered with his dying breath, "The treasure will betray you, as it betrayed me." Instead, they celebrated their newfound power, blind to the shadows gathering at the edges of their triumph. The dynasty grew stronger, their name spreading across lands and kingdoms. Kings and queens bowed before them, their wealth dazzling and their influence unmatched. But beneath the surface, the curse festered. Greed turned brother against brother, father against son. The Nibelungs became prisoners of their own ambition, their hearts hardened and their hands stained with blood. The treasure was theirs, but it did not belong to them. It never truly belonged to anyone. It was a thing of chaos, of greed, of sorrow. And though the Nibelungs stood tall, their legacy shining brighter than the sun, there was something waiting in the shadows. Something that would rise when they least expected it. Something that would take back what they thought was theirs. On the night Siegfried was born, the wind in Xanten howled like a wounded beast. The heavens churned with restless clouds, their shapes shifting as if gods and giants waged war among the stars. Lightning split the skies, illuminating the great hall of King Siegmund and Queen Sieglind. Within, the cries of a newborn filled the air, sharp and unyielding, a sound that seemed to demand the world to listen. The midwives whispered to each other, their hands trembling as they wrapped the boy in soft cloth. "This child," one muttered, her voice barely audible over the storm outside, "he will not be ordinary." Even then, before words could form on his lips or strength filled his limbs, Siegfried's presence was undeniable. His first breath seemed to pull at the air itself, as though nature bent to his will. Siegmund, tall and proud, gazed down at his son with a mixture of awe and fear. He was a warrior king, hardened by battle and the weight of a crown, yet even he felt the strange, electric pull of the child's gaze. Sieglind, pale and weary from the birth, clutched her son tightly. "He will do great things," she whispered, though her voice carried not just hope but something darker, a tremor, a premonition she dared not speak aloud. The boy's lineage was no simple thing. He carried the blood of Siegmund, a king whose ancestors had struck bargains with gods and whose sword had tasted the blood of countless foes. But Sieglind's line was more mysterious, shadowed by old tales of magic and sorrow. Her ancestors spoke to rivers and trees, their voices lost to time but their power lingering in her veins. Together, their bloodline forged something new, something the world had never seen before. In the days that followed, strange omens surrounded Siegfried. A raven, black as midnight, perched on the roof of the great hall, its unblinking eyes fixed on the boy's cradle. Wolves gathered at the edge of the forest, their howls blending with the wind as if singing a lament. The villagers whispered of these signs, their voices hushed as though the very air could betray them. "The gods are watching him," they said. But is it blessing or curse? As Siegfried grew, his spirit was untamed, as wild as the storms that raged on the night of his birth. He did not walk as other children did. He ran, his small feet pounding the earth with a force that made it seem as though the ground itself yielded to him. His laughter was loud, unrestrained, echoing through the halls of Xanten and beyond. But with that laughter came defiance. No boundary could contain him, no rule could tame him. When he was but a child, barely old enough to lift a sword, he wandered into the deep woods beyond the castle. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches weaving shadows that danced on the forest floor. Sieglind called after him, her voice tinged with panic, but Siegfried did not turn back. He walked with purpose, his small hands brushing against the rough bark of ancient oaks. It was there, deep within the forest, that he encountered his first test. A wild stag, its antlers gleaming like ivory, stood in his path. The beast snorted, its breath misting in the cool air, but it did not flee. Siegfried stared at the creature, his young face calm, but his eyes blazing with something far older than his years. He stepped closer, and the stag bowed its head, as if in recognition of something it could not name. Word of Siegfried's strange encounter spread quickly, and with it came both awe and fear. The people of Xanten began to see the boy not just as their prince, but as something more, something otherworldly. They whispered stories, some calling him a gift from the gods, others warning that his birth had upset the balance of the world. Siegmund and Sieglind watched their son with heavy hearts. They loved him fiercely, but they knew that love alone could not shield him from the weight of his destiny. One night, as Siegmund sharpened his sword by the fire, he spoke to Sieglind in a low, grave voice. "Our son will shake the earth," he said, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "But whether he brings glory or ruin, I cannot say." The years passed, and Siegfried's strength grew, both in body and spirit. By the time he was a young man, his feats were already the stuff of legend. He wrestled bears in the mountains, their roars echoing through the valleys before they fell to his might. He tamed wild horses that no other could ride, their manes whipping in the wind as he rode them across the fields. And yet, for all his power, there was a restlessness in him, a hunger that no victory could satisfy. One day, as Siegfried stood on the cliffs overlooking the Rhine, he felt it, a pull, deep in his chest, as though the river itself called to him. The water churned below, its surface glinting with a light that seemed to come from within. He did not yet know the stories of the treasure hidden in its depths, nor the curse that clung to it like a shadow. But he felt its presence, an invisible thread tugging at his soul. Siegfried turned away from the river that day, but the feeling stayed with him. It lingered in the quiet moments, in the stillness before sleep, in the pauses between his triumphs. He could not name it, but he knew it was coming. Something was waiting for him, something that would test every fiber of his being. As he stood on the cusp of manhood, the people of Xanten celebrated him, their cheers ringing out like thunder. But beneath their joy was a current of unease, a silent recognition that Siegfried was more than a man. He was a storm, waiting to break. The clang of hammer against metal rang out in the stillness, a sharp, relentless rhythm that seemed to echo through the mountains themselves. Sparks flew like falling stars, lighting the shadows of the forge in bursts of fiery brilliance. At the heart of it all was Siegfried, sweat dripping down his brow, his hands blistered and raw but unwavering. He was no stranger to challenges, but this was different. This was a test of patience, of focus, of something deeper than brute strength. Mime the smith watched from a distance, his sharp eyes glinting in the firelight. He was a small, wiry man, his years spent bent over anvils and molten steel carved into every line of his face. But there was something else in his gaze as he studied Siegfried, not just the critical eye of a master, but the weight of a secret he carried alone. Mime knew why Siegfried had come to him. He had seen the fire in the young man's eyes, the kind of fire that burned not just for glory but for destiny. The task was impossible, or so it seemed. The sword Siegfried sought to forge was no ordinary blade. It was meant to cut through steel as if it were air, to withstand battles that could crush mountains. More than that, it was to carry a piece of Siegfried's soul, a weapon that would not just follow him into battle but define him. And yet, the shards of the sword he had brought to Mime lay cold and lifeless on the anvil, mocking his efforts. This was no ordinary sword, it was the remnants of a legendary blade, shattered in a battle long forgotten but still whispered about in hushed tones. Mime knew the tales. He knew what this sword once was and what it could become, but he also knew the danger it carried. "The metal remembers," he said one night, his voice low and gravelly. "It remembers its victories, its betrayals, its blood." Siegfried did not flinch. "Then I will make it remember me," he said, his voice steady. Day after day, the forge became a battlefield. Siegfried fought not with sword and shield, but with fire and steel, with every ounce of strength and resolve he could summon. He pumped the bellows until the flames roared like a living beast, their heat licking at his skin. He hammered the metal until his arms ached, each strike a defiance against failure. And yet, the shards resisted him. They refused to bend, refused to fuse, as if testing his worth. There were moments when doubt crept in, silent and insidious. He could feel it in the weight of the hammer, in the stubborn coldness of the steel. "Why won't it yield?" he growled one night, his frustration spilling over. Mime, who had been silently watching, stepped forward. "Because it is more than steel," the old smith said. "It needs more than fire to come alive. It needs you, your will, your purpose. A sword like this is not just forged, it is born." Siegfried stared at the shards, his chest heaving. He understood, though he wished he didn't. The sword demanded more than his skill. It demanded his essence, his very being. With that realization, something shifted. He approached the forge not just with strength, but with intention, with focus. Every strike of the hammer carried not just force, but meaning. He poured his soul into the work, letting the flames and the steel consume him. One night, as the moon hung low and the forge glowed with an otherworldly light, it happened. The shards, so stubborn and lifeless before, began to yield. They glowed with a fiery brilliance, their edges softening, their forms merging. Siegfried's hands moved with a precision he didn't know he possessed, as if guided by something greater than himself. The sword took shape, its blade long and slender, its surface shimmering like liquid light. But the process was not without cost. The fire roared hotter than ever, its heat searing Siegfried's skin, the air thick with the smell of burning flesh. Pain shot through him, but he did not falter. His hands bled, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he pressed on. He could feel the sword pulling at him, demanding more, testing his resolve. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, it was finished. Siegfried stood in the forge, his body battered and broken, but his eyes alight with triumph. In his hands, the sword gleamed, its edge so sharp it seemed to cut the very air around it. Balmung, it was not just a weapon. It was a part of him now, an extension of his will, his destiny forged in steel. Mime approached, his expression unreadable. He reached out, his fingers brushing the blade's surface, and for a moment, a flicker of fear crossed his face. "It is beautiful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And terrible." Siegfried looked at the sword, his grip firm but reverent. He did not need words to understand what Mime meant. He could feel it, the power, the weight of what he had created. It was a blade that could change the course of fate, but it was not without its price. As he left the forge, Balmung at his side, the air around him seemed to hum with anticipation. The villagers who saw him pass stopped in their tracks, their eyes wide with awe and something darker. They did not know what Siegfried had forged, but they could feel it. It was in the way he walked, the way the very ground seemed to tremble beneath his feet. Balmung was more than a sword. It was a promise, a warning, and a beacon. And though Siegfried's hand rested easily on its hilt, he knew it was only the beginning. The blade had been born, but its purpose had yet to be revealed. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Balmung would not rest quietly. It hungered, just as Siegfried did, for what lay ahead. The forest was unnaturally still, as if every living thing held its breath. Siegfried stood alone in the clearing, his sword Balmung gleaming in the pale light filtering through the trees. The air carried a weight, thick with something unspoken yet undeniable. Beneath his boots, the earth was dry and cracked, lifeless in a way that felt wrong. This place, he knew, was marked by death. Ahead of him, a faint rumble stirred the silence. It began as a low vibration in the ground, growing stronger with each passing second. The trees seemed to tremble, their leaves shivering like frightened whispers. Siegfried tightened his grip on Balmung, the blade cold and steady in his hand. He was not afraid, but something deeper, a sense of inevitability, settled over him like a shadow. And then it came. Fafnir. The dragon emerged from the depths of the earth, its massive body dragging itself through the clearing. Its scales shimmered like molten gold, but beneath their beauty was an impenetrable hardness, a shield forged by time and greed. Its eyes burned with an ancient rage, glowing embers set in a face that was all hunger and fury. Each breath it exhaled sent plumes of black smoke curling into the sky, and the ground cracked further beneath its weight. For a moment, Siegfried simply stared. He had heard the stories, the songs of Fafnir's terror and its hoard of cursed gold. But nothing could have prepared him for the sheer presence of the beast. It was not just a dragon, it was an embodiment of something far older, far darker. Yet as the beast's gaze locked onto him, Siegfried felt no urge to flee. The dragon roared, a sound that tore through the forest like a storm, shaking the trees to their roots. Siegfried stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest, but his resolve unshaken. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate, the weight of Balmung a reassurance in his hand. Fafnir lunged, its massive body surging forward with impossible speed. Siegfried leapt aside, the ground where he had stood exploding into shards of dirt and stone under the dragon's claws. He moved with precision, each step calculated, each breath steady. The beast struck again, its tail whipping through the air, but Siegfried ducked, the wind of its movement brushing past him like a warning. Time seemed to slow as the two circled each other, predator and prey, though it was not clear who was which. Siegfried's mind raced, not with fear but with clarity. He watched the dragon's movements, the way its muscles coiled before each strike, the brief flicker in its eyes before it lunged. And then he saw it, a moment, a weakness. The beast reared back, its mouth opening wide to unleash a torrent of fire. Siegfried surged forward, his body moving before thought could catch up. Balmung glinted as he raised it high, its edge cutting through the air with a sound that seemed to split the world. He brought it down with all his strength, aiming for the soft underside of the dragon's throat. The blade struck true. Fafnir's roar turned into a deafening scream, its body thrashing violently as blood, black and steaming, poured from the wound. Siegfried held his ground, gripping Balmung with both hands as the dragon's massive form writhed in agony. The beast's tail lashed out, catching him across the chest and sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to his feet, his eyes never leaving the dragon. Fafnir collapsed, its body trembling with each labored breath. The light in its eyes dimmed, replaced by something almost sorrowful, almost human. As Siegfried approached, the beast let out one final, shuddering breath, its massive frame sinking into stillness. The forest fell silent once more. The smell of blood and smoke hung heavy in the air. Siegfried stood over the dragon's body, Balmung still clenched in his hand, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The battle was over, but he knew it was not the end. The dragon's blood, dark and glistening, pooled around its lifeless form. He knelt, his movements slow and deliberate. Dipping his hand into the blood, he felt its heat, its strange texture that seemed both liquid and something more. Without hesitation, he rose and removed his armor, letting it fall to the ground in a clatter of steel. The blood called to him, not with words, but with a pull he could not resist. He stepped into the pool, feeling it seep into his skin, its warmth spreading through his body like fire. It was unlike anything he had ever felt, a power that coursed through him, filling him with an unshakable strength. He stood taller, his breath steadier, his body invulnerable. But then, something small and fleeting, a leaf, golden and trembling in the air, drifted from the trees above. It landed softly on his back, unnoticed, sticking to the skin where the blood had not touched. It was a moment so brief it could have been missed, but it was enough. As Siegfried stepped out of the pool, the blood drying on his skin like armor, he felt invincible. The pain from the battle was gone, replaced by a surging energy that made him feel as though he could challenge the very gods. Balmung rested easily in his hand, its edge sharper, its presence more commanding than ever before. But the spot on his back, where the leaf had rested, remained untouched by the blood. And though Siegfried did not know it, this single moment, this small imperfection, would echo far beyond this day, shaping the path that lay ahead. The forest, now silent, seemed to hold its breath once more. The dragon was dead, its blood soaked into the earth, but the air was heavy with something that could not be named. Siegfried turned, his step steady, his gaze fixed forward. The dragon's death was only the beginning. The curse of its blood, the weight of Balmung, and the shadow of that untouched spot would follow him, silent and patient, waiting for the moment when they would claim their due. The cavern yawned before Siegfried, its depths stretching into shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The dragon's blood still clung to his skin, its warmth fading but its power lingering in his veins. The air inside was cold, heavy with a silence that felt oppressive, broken only by the faint, rhythmic drip of water echoing through the dark. His steps were slow, deliberate, the weight of Balmung steady at his side. The treasure lay ahead. It did not glow like in the stories, there was no golden light spilling forth, no inviting shimmer. Instead, the horde crouched in the gloom, vast and still, like a predator waiting to strike. Mounds of gold rose and fell like frozen waves, coins and jewels scattered in chaotic abundance. It was wealth beyond measure, yet something about it felt wrong. The air seemed charged, almost humming with tension. Siegfried took another step forward, his eyes scanning the cavern. He had not sought the horde for greed, he had slain Fafnir for the challenge, for the glory. And yet, now that he stood before it, the weight of what he had earned settled over him. This was not just treasure. It was something more, something darker. Among the gold, nestled like a secret too terrible to be spoken aloud, lay the ring. At first, it seemed insignificant, small and unassuming against the vast wealth surrounding it. A simple band of gold, its surface smooth and unbroken. But as Siegfried drew closer, it seemed to shift, catching the dim light in a way that made it glimmer with an almost hypnotic pull. He stopped, his breath hitching for just a moment. The ring seemed to watch him. He reached for it, his hand steady despite the sudden tension in the air. The moment his fingers closed around the ring, a sharp jolt shot through him, like the crack of lightning splitting the sky. He stumbled, the cavern spinning around him as a low, guttural voice filled his mind. "The ring is mine," it growled, the words curling like smoke in his thoughts. He gritted his teeth, clutching the ring tighter as the voice faded, leaving only the echo of its presence. For a moment, the weight of the band in his hand felt unbearable, as if it carried centuries of rage and sorrow within its tiny circle. But Siegfried's grip did not falter. He slipped the ring onto his finger. The moment it touched his skin, the cavern seemed to shift. The silence grew heavier, pressing against him from all sides. The gold around him seemed to glow faintly, a pale, sickly light that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He could feel it now, the curse. It was not something he could see or hear, but it wrapped itself around him like an unseen chain, cold and unyielding. Siegfried clenched his fist, his jaw tightening. He would not be cowed. This treasure, this ring, belonged to him now. Whatever shadows clung to it, whatever whispers followed in its wake, he would bear them. He had faced the dragon's wrath, bathed in its blood, forged his destiny in the fire of his will. What was a curse to a man like him? And yet, the ring felt heavier with each passing moment, as if it carried more than just its weight in gold. The hoard itself seemed to change now that it was his. What had once seemed like lifeless wealth now breathed with a strange, unsettling energy. The coins gleamed with an almost malevolent light, their edges sharp enough to cut. The jewels sparkled, but their beauty was cold, distant, as though they held secrets they dared not reveal. Siegfried gathered the hoard, his movements brisk but deliberate. The treasure was his to guard now, its vast wealth a testament to his victory, his strength. But with each piece he touched, a strange unease settled deeper into his chest. The gold felt alive in his hands, not with warmth, but with something colder, something ancient and watchful. As he worked, the voice returned. Mine, it hissed, softer this time but no less fierce. It coiled through his thoughts, its tone both desperate and defiant. Siegfried paused, his grip tightening on Balmont. He spoke aloud, his voice cutting through the cavern like steel. It belongs to me now, he said, his words firm, unyielding. The voice laughed, a sound that echoed through the cavern, hollow and mocking. The ring chooses no master, it said, fading into the shadows once more. The hoard was vast, and though Siegfried worked tirelessly, it seemed endless. Each coin, each jewel, each golden artifact felt like a piece of a larger puzzle, one that shifted and changed the longer he looked at it. The curse whispered at the edges of his mind, its presence constant but elusive, like a shadow that danced just beyond the reach of the firelight. And yet, Siegfried did not falter. He emerged from the cavern, the hoard secured, the ring gleaming on his finger. The light of the sun was blinding after the oppressive darkness, but it carried no warmth. The treasure felt heavier in the daylight, its presence a weight that pressed against him from all sides. The villagers who saw him pass whispered among themselves, their eyes wide with awe and fear. They could see the change in him, though they dared not speak of it. Siegfried's steps were steady, his gaze fixed forward, but there was something in his shadow now, something that did not belong. The ring was a part of him, as much as Balmont, as much as the dragon's blood in his veins. It bound him to the hoard, to its curse, to the weight of its history. He wore it like a badge of honor, but beneath the surface, it pulsed with its own life, its own will. The sky darkened as he walked, though no clouds marred the horizon. The air grew colder, the wind sharper. The treasure was his, but its price was yet to be paid. And as Siegfried moved forward, the whispers of the ring followed, soft and insistent, a reminder that what he had claimed would not let him go so easily. The weight of the curse hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable, as Siegfried's path stretched out before him, unknown and unrelenting. The moon hung low over Burgundy, its pale light washing the castle in a soft, silvery glow. The halls were silent, the kind of stillness that feels too fragile, as if even a whisper could shatter it. Somewhere in the quiet of her chamber, Kriemhild stirred, her golden hair spread across her pillow like threads of sunlight caught in shadow. Her breathing was soft, steady, until it wasn't. Her brow furrowed, her lips parted in an almost silent gasp. Something unseen pulled her deeper, beyond the comforting veil of sleep and into the dark. The dream began slowly, like the first note of a mournful song, subtle yet relentless. In the vision, she stood in a vast meadow, endless and green under a sky that seemed both too bright and too hollow. At her feet, the grass swayed, not with the gentle caress of a breeze, but as if it were restless, warning her to leave. She looked up, and there it was, the falcon. It was magnificent, its feathers shining with an iridescent sheen, its eyes fierce and unyielding. The bird soared high, cutting through the heavens with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. Kriemhild's heart swelled with a sudden, inexplicable joy as she watched it. This falcon was hers, though she could not say how she knew. It was strong, proud, untouchable. It circled above her, its sharp cries piercing the silence, filling her chest with a strange, aching pride. But then the sky changed. The light dimmed, and the air grew heavy. Clouds gathered, dark and churning, swallowing the endless blue. The falcon's flight grew erratic, its wings beating harder, faster, as if it sensed something she could not see. Kriemhild called out, her voice trembling, though the words were snatched away by the rising wind. And then they came, the eagles. They descended like shadows, swift and merciless. Their eyes burned with a cold, predatory light, and their talons gleamed like blades. There were 3 of them, and they moved with a cruel precision, their wings cutting through the air with a sound that felt like the shattering of something sacred. The falcon fought. Oh, how it fought! It twisted and turned, its cries sharp with defiance as it struck at its attackers. For a moment, Kriemhild believed it might win, that its strength, its sheer will, would be enough. But the eagles were relentless. They tore into the falcon, their talons raking through its feathers, their beaks striking with savage precision. Kriemhild's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, her hands clutching at the restless grass. The pain was unbearable, though it was not her body that bore the wounds. The falcon faltered, its proud cries turning to desperate screams. Blood, dark and vivid, spattered the earth, staining the green with a crimson that seemed to spread, swallowing the meadow in its wake. She screamed, her voice raw and breaking, but it was useless. The falcon fell, its body limp, its wings broken. The eagles circled above, their cries echoing with a cruel triumph, before disappearing into the darkened sky. Kriemhild crawled to the fallen bird, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch it. Its feathers, once so vibrant, were dull now, matted with blood. Its chest no longer rose and fell, its fierce eyes now closed. She cradled it in her arms, tears streaming down her face, her heart breaking with a pain she could not name. The meadow faded. Kriemhild woke with a start, her body drenched in sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs. The moonlight streamed through the window, its pale glow doing little to chase away the lingering shadows of the dream. She sat up, her hands clutching the covers, her breath shallow and uneven. The falcon's cries still echoed in her ears, a haunting refrain that refused to fade. Her chest ached, as if the wounds the bird had suffered were her own. She pressed her hand to her heart, trying to steady herself, but the feeling would not leave her. She glanced at the empty space beside her, the absence of her beloved Siegfried suddenly unbearable. The dream had felt so real, its images so vivid, that she could still feel the warmth of the falcon's blood on her hands. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Her eyes fell on the window, where the faintest hint of dawn began to touch the horizon. She could not shake the feeling that the dream was not just a dream. It was a warning, a shadow cast before the coming storm. She whispered his name, her voice trembling in the quiet. Somewhere beyond the walls of the castle, the world turned, oblivious to the fears that gripped her heart. But Kriemhild knew. The falcon was more than just a bird. And though she could not yet see the eagles circling, she knew they were there, waiting, watching, biding their time. The banners of Burgundy fluttered in the wind, their crimson fabric streaked with gold, bold against the pale gray of the winter sky. In the courtyard of Worms, the air crackled with tension, the kind that lived in the silent spaces between words. Soldiers lined the stone walls, their armor gleaming, their faces impassive. But their eyes, sharp, darting, always watching, betrayed the truth. Something was always brewing in the court of King Gunther. Inside the great hall, shadows flickered along the high vaulted ceilings, cast by the wavering flames of the torches. King Gunther sat upon his throne, his figure imposing, though not as much by his presence as by the weight of the crown that rested on his brow. His hands, strong and calloused, gripped the arms of his chair, and his eyes surveyed the room with a quiet intensity. His was a rule balanced on a knife's edge, where each choice, each alliance, could bring either glory or ruin. Beside him stood his mother, Queen Ute, her bearing regal but her expression unreadable. Her silver hair, braided with care, caught the light in a way that softened her stern features. But Ute was not a woman easily dismissed. She had spent years weaving the threads of influence, her voice a quiet but steady current in the river of politics that flowed through Worms. She knew the ambitions of her sons, the strengths and weaknesses of their allies, the whispers that traveled like ghosts in the dark corners of the castle. And then there was Hagen von Tronje. Hagen stood a little apart from the royal family, his armor polished to a dark sheen that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. His face, angular and marked with scars, was unreadable, but his eyes burned with a cold fire. Hagen was the king's most trusted advisor, his shadow, his sword. But even trust had its limits in a court such as this. Hagen's loyalty was not born of love or devotion, it was calculated, measured, tied to ambitions that stretched further than Worms. As the council gathered that day, the air grew heavier, each word spoken weighed as carefully as gold. Gunther's voice was calm but commanding, his words deliberate. He spoke of alliances, of borders, of enemies that watched them from afar. Burgundy was strong, its armies feared, its wealth unmatched. But Gunther knew better than to believe strength alone could protect them. Power was not just taken, it had to be maintained, a constant battle fought not only with swords, but with wits. Hagen's voice cut through the room like a blade. He spoke of threats, of whispers carried on the winds from the north and the east. He named their enemies, their ambitions, their weaknesses. But his words held more than warnings, they carried a challenge, a question unspoken but felt by all. Were they strong enough to face what was coming? Could Gunther hold his throne, his kingdom, his life? Uda's eyes never left Hagen as he spoke. She knew his kind too well, men who thrived in the shadows, who built their power on secrets and silence. But she also knew they were necessary. In the dangerous dance of power, the steps were never simple, never clean. As the court debated, voices rising and falling like the tide, Gunther leaned back in his throne, his eyes distant. He was a king, but he was also a man, and the weight of both was heavier than any crown. He thought of his brothers, Gernot and Giselher, their loyalty unshaken but their ambitions no less fierce. He thought of Kriemhild, his sister, her beauty and grace unmatched, her love for Siegfried a bond that could either strengthen their house or shatter it. And then there was the Hoard. The cursed treasure of the Nibelungs, a prize so great it could bring any kingdom to its knees. It had been claimed, but its shadow lingered, stretching far beyond the cavern where it had been taken. Gunther felt its weight even now, though it was not in his hands. It was a prize, yes, but it was also a curse, and curses had a way of finding their mark. Hagen watched the king in silence, his mind working like the gears of a great machine. He saw the uncertainty in Gunther's eyes, the hesitation that came with power too tightly held. Hagen had no such doubts. His ambitions were clear, his path set. He would do whatever it took to protect Burgundy, to secure its place in the world. And if that meant bloodshed, betrayal, or worse, so be it. The court adjourned, the echoes of their words lingering in the hall like the fading notes of a somber song. Gunther remained seated, his hand still gripping the arms of his throne. Yud approached him, her steps soft but sure. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch both comforting and firm. "You must be strong," she said, her voice low but steady. "For your kingdom. For your family." Gunther nodded, but his gaze was distant, his thoughts elsewhere. Hagen lingered at the edge of the room, his shadow long against the stone floor. He watched the king, the queen, the empty throne that could so easily be filled by another. Power was a fleeting thing, and Hagen knew better than to trust in its permanence. The fires in the hall burned low, the light flickering and dim. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the unspoken promises of both glory and ruin. And within the court of worms, the shadows grew longer, stretching toward the unseen future that awaited them all. The morning sun burned through the mist, setting the horizon ablaze in hues of gold and crimson. Hooves thundered against the earth as Siegfried rode toward Worms, his heart steady but his mind restless. Each mile brought him closer to the court of Burgundy, a place where his name had already begun to echo. He carried no banners, no pomp to announce his arrival, only his sword, his armor, and the quiet confidence of a man destined for something greater. Siegfried was no stranger to the weight of expectation. In the towns and villages he passed, whispers trailed him like shadows. Tales of his victories, his strength, his unyielding courage had traveled ahead of him. Some spoke of him as a hero, others as a man who sought power beyond what mortal hands should hold. But Siegfried paid no heed to the voices. His path was his own, and he would carve it as he had always done, with steel and resolve. The gates of Worms loomed before him, tall and unyielding, a fortress of stone and pride. The guards who stood watch straightened at the sight of him, their eyes widening with recognition. Even here, in this foreign court, his reputation had preceded him. They exchanged uncertain glances, but did not bar his path. Siegfried nodded, his expression calm, and rode into the city. Worms was alive with movement, its streets bustling with merchants, soldiers, and courtiers. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the sharp tang of iron and leather. Children darted between stalls, their laughter light against the heavier murmur of adult voices. But as Siegfried passed, a hush seemed to follow. Heads turned, whispers rose. They knew who he was, the Dragon Slayer, the bearer of Balmung, the man said to have bathed in the blood of a beast and emerged invulnerable. Yet amidst the awe, there were also sidelong glances, cautious and calculating. Worms was not a place for blind admiration. It was a court where ambition thrived, where alliances were forged and broken with a single word. Siegfried understood this. He felt the undercurrents, the invisible threads of power that stretched through the city like a web. He had stepped into it willingly, knowing that every step he took would pull the strings tighter. The great hall of Worms was a marvel of stone and wood, its high ceilings adorned with banners of Burgundy. Siegfried entered with purpose, his footsteps echoing against the polished floor. King Gunther sat upon his throne, his gaze sharp and appraising. To his right stood Hagen von Tronje, his expression unreadable but his eyes fixed on Siegfried with a mix of interest and something darker. Queen Ute observed from her place, her calm demeanor masking the calculations that flickered behind her gaze. Siegfried inclined his head respectfully but did not bow. He met Gunther's gaze directly, his presence unyielding but not arrogant. The court watched in silence, the tension palpable. Here was a man who had slain a dragon, who carried the curse of the Nibelung horde, who sought not to serve, but to stand as an equal. It was a boldness that could either win favor or spark enmity. Gunther's voice broke the silence, welcoming Siegfried with a tone that was cordial but guarded. The pleasantries were brief, the words polite but heavy with subtext. Siegfried answered with equal measure, his tone steady, his words chosen with care. This was not a meeting of strangers, it was the first move in a game where every gesture, every glance, held meaning. As the court resumed its activities, Siegfried's attention was drawn to a figure who had entered the hall quietly, almost unnoticed. She moved with a grace that seemed effortless, her presence commanding not through force, but through a quiet radiance. Kriemhild. The name alone sent a shiver through him, though he had only heard it whispered in tales. Her beauty was striking, but it was not what held him captive. It was the way she carried herself, the light in her eyes that seemed to hold both innocence and wisdom. She was not merely a princess, she was a force, a presence that could not be ignored. Siegfried felt a pull, a connection that was as inexplicable as it was undeniable. Kriemhild glanced toward him, her gaze meeting his briefly before she looked away, her cheeks flushing faintly. It was a moment so brief it could have been imagined, but to Siegfried, it felt as though the world had shifted. He had faced dragons, battles, and curses without hesitation, but in that single glance, he felt something stir within him that was both thrilling and terrifying. The court watched the exchange, though it was subtle, almost imperceptible. Hagen's gaze lingered on Siegfried, his expression unreadable. Gunther's lips pressed into a thin line, his thoughts his own. Buda's eyes flicked between her son and the warrior, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. They saw what Siegfried himself was only beginning to understand. As the day wore on, Siegfried found himself drawn to the gardens of the castle, a place of quiet amidst the bustle of the court. The air was cool, the scent of blooming flowers mingling with the faint rustle of leaves. He walked alone, his thoughts heavy, his steps unhurried. And then, she was there. Kriemhild stood beneath an ancient oak, her hands clasped before her, her gaze distant. She did not see him at first, her thoughts seemingly far away. But when she turned and their eyes met, the world seemed to hold its breath. Siegfried approached slowly, his heart pounding in a way it never had in battle. Kriemhild did not move, did not speak, but her eyes held his with a mixture of curiosity and something he could not name. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than he intended, the words simple but sincere. They spoke for what felt like hours, though time seemed to lose meaning in her presence. They spoke of many things, of Worms, of Siegfried's travels, of Kriemhild's dreams. Her voice was a melody, her laughter a balm to the tension he carried. And when she smiled, it was as though the sun itself had broken through the clouds. But beneath the joy, there was an undercurrent of something darker, something unspoken. Siegfried felt it, a shadow that lingered at the edges of their conversation. He saw it in the way Kriemhild's gaze would occasionally drift, as though she sensed something she could not name. It was as though the very air around them carried a warning, a whisper of what was to come. When they parted, Siegfried watched her go, his heart heavy with a mixture of hope and foreboding. He knew he had stepped into something far greater than himself, a story that had already begun to unfold long before his arrival. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the castle of worms into shadow, Siegfried could not shake the feeling that the course of his life had irrevocably changed. The sound of armor clanking echoed through the courtyard, a harsh, metallic rhythm that seemed to shake the very air. The great stone walls of Worms stood like silent sentinels as Siegfried strode into the heart of the castle grounds, his eyes locked ahead. The whispers of the court followed him, barely audible but full of weight. They had watched him arrive, heard the tales of his strength, of his dragon slaying, of the treasure that he had claimed. But now, they would see for themselves if the stories were true. King Gunther's eyes narrowed from the balcony above, his gaze sharp, calculating. This was no simple guest, no wandering hero seeking shelter. Siegfried had come with purpose, to prove himself, to stake his claim, and perhaps, in the end, to take what he believed was his by right. The court gathered, silent and expectant, as if holding their breath for the moment that was about to unfold. Siegfried stood in the center of the courtyard, his armor gleaming in the midday sun. The weight of it was nothing to him. He wore it like a second skin, forged for battles greater than any he had yet known. His grip tightened around the hilt of Balmung, the sword that had cleaved the dragon Fafnir in two, the sword that had made him invulnerable. His eyes, bright and focused, scanned the faces before him, daring anyone to challenge him. Gunther's voice rang out, cold and commanding. If you truly seek a place in our court, Siegfried, you will prove yourself. Strength is the true measure of a man here in Worms. Show us that you are worthy. The words hung in the air like an unspoken promise, prove yourself, or leave. Siegfried stood tall, his chest rising with a steady breath. He had no intention of leaving. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. The challenge was not a choice, it was the only path forward. Without a word, he walked to the center of the courtyard where a massive stone pillar stood, taller than any man, its surface smooth and unyielding. It had been placed there by Gunther's own command, an obstacle designed for just such a moment as this. Several men had tried before to move it, to topple it. None had succeeded. It had become a symbol of the king's power, a reminder of the strength required to stand in his court. Siegfried's eyes traced the pillar, his brow furrowing. He knew this was more than a simple test of strength, it was a statement. A challenge not just to his physical ability, but to his very worth. The court watched, and Gunther's gaze never left him, waiting for the hero to fail. With a single, fluid motion, Siegfried stepped forward, planting his feet firmly on the ground. His muscles tensed beneath his armor as he bent down and gripped the stone pillar. The sound of his breath, steady and controlled, mixed with the creak of the stone as he began to lift. His arms flexed, veins pulsing beneath the surface, his entire body working in unison to move the immovable. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The onlookers, the soldiers, the courtiers, all of them held their breath, waiting for the inevitable. Would he succeed? Or would he fail, like so many before him? The pillar shifted. Barely at first, but then, with a grunt of effort, Siegfried heaved it from the ground. The stone scraped against the earth, the sound grinding against the silence of the courtyard. His breath was harsh now, sweat dripping down his brow, but he did not stop. With a final, powerful push, the pillar moved, inch by inch, until it rolled away from where it had been firmly planted for so long. The court gasped. Gunther's eyes widened in disbelief, though his face remained as impassive as ever. Hagen's gaze was cold, calculating, but even he could not hide the flicker of surprise in his eyes. The onlookers murmured in awe. Siegfried had done what no one else had dared to do. He had shown them that strength was not just in the body, but in the will. But that was not the end of it. Gunther's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd, laced with the faintest edge of challenge. Impressive, Siegfried. But strength alone does not make a man worthy of a place at this court. Prove that your heart is as strong as your body. Siegfried, still panting from the effort, wiped the sweat from his brow and nodded. The court had seen his strength, but Gunther was not satisfied. The king's eyes were sharp, waiting for the next test. There could be no easy victories here. No mercy. The challenge was not just one of muscles, but of spirit. In the distance, the sound of a horn echoed through the air. From the gates of the castle, a procession emerged. A line of knights, draped in the banners of Burgundy, rode forward, their horses powerful and proud. At their helm was a man, massive in size, his armor gleaming as he reined in his steed before Siegfried. The knight was known throughout the kingdom for his strength and skill in battle. "Defeat me in combat," the knight declared, his voice booming, "and I will acknowledge your worth." Siegfried's gaze met the knight's, the challenge clear in both their eyes. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, his hand tightening around the hilt of Baumont. The sword felt like an extension of his own will, ready to slice through the air, ready to defend his honor. The two men circled each other, their eyes never leaving one another, each waiting for the other to make the first move. The silence of the courtyard stretched, thick with anticipation. And then, with a sudden roar, the knight lunged forward, his sword raised high. The battle that followed was a whirlwind of motion, steel clashing against steel, the sound of it ringing through the air like thunder. The knight was skilled, no doubt, but Siegfried moved with the precision of a predator, each strike calculated, each parry deliberate. His strength, his agility, his experience, they all came together in perfect harmony. And with a final, decisive strike, Siegfried disarmed his opponent, sending the knight to the ground. For a moment, there was silence. The knight lay in the dust, staring up at Siegfried, his chest heaving. There was no anger in his eyes, only respect. Slowly, he stood, and with a nod of admiration, he stepped aside, acknowledging Siegfried's victory. Gunther watched, his expression unreadable. Hagen's eyes narrowed, and Jute, ever the observer, allowed a small, knowing smile to flicker across her lips. The court had seen enough. Siegfried had proven himself. But even in his moment of triumph, Siegfried knew that this was only the beginning. The tests would not stop here. In Worms, nothing was ever truly won without a price. And the shadows that lingered around the throne, those unseen forces, were watching closely, calculating their next move. The wind howled through the high cliffs of Iceland, carrying with it the smell of the sea and the bitter taste of snow. On the far horizon, a solitary figure stood against the sky, her silhouette sharp, regal, and untouchable. Brunhild. The Queen of Iceland, a woman of immense beauty and strength, ruled over her kingdom with the kind of quiet, fierce authority that left no room for doubt. Her warriors revered her, and her enemies feared her. But despite all the power she wielded, her heart was untouched, guarded like a treasure locked in a vault. No man had yet come to claim it, and no man would, unless he was worthy. Word of her greatness had reached across the seas, to the land of Burgundy, where King Gunther sat on his throne, restless. His thoughts turned to one thing, Brunhild. To marry her would be the union of two mighty kingdoms, a match of unmatched power. But Gunther knew that the queen could not be won by mere wealth or titles. She demanded strength, courage, and above all, honor. Yet, even as Gunther pondered his path, he could not help but feel something dark stirring within him. Brunhild was a challenge, one he might not be able to face alone. So he turned to Siegfried, the man whose name had become synonymous with heroism, whose strength had already been proven in the eyes of the court. Siegfried, with his invulnerability and unmatched skill, was the only one who might be able to help Gunther win Brunhild's favor. But there was a catch, a price that Gunther was willing to pay. It was not a price of gold, nor one of land, but one of deceit. Gunther, ever the schemer, did not ask Siegfried to win the queen's heart through honest means. He wanted Brunhild, but he wanted her without the labor of proving his worth. He sought a shortcut, a way to deceive the queen into submission. And so, he asked Siegfried to take on the mantle of his rival, disguised as Gunther, to challenge Brunhild in ways that only she could understand. In return, Gunther promised Siegfried his sister, Kriemhild, as a bride. The weight of the request hit Siegfried like a thunderclap. Deception, betrayal, trickery, these were not things he had ever considered before. His heart had always beaten in line with honor, with truth. But this was Gunther's plan, and Siegfried, as loyal as he was to his companion, could not refuse. His mind raced with the implications. Was this truly what Gunther wanted? Or had his king already been overtaken by ambition? Yet, the promise of Kriemhild's hand in marriage was too enticing to ignore. He was trapped in the web of ambition, his own desires mingling with the corruption of his friend's plan. Siegfried knew he had no choice. He had to become someone else, to wear a mask that concealed his true self, to play the part of a king while the real king remained in the shadows. And so, he began the journey to Iceland with Gunther's name on his lips, a secret he would carry with him like a burden on his soul. As the long journey stretched out before him, Siegfried's mind wandered. He thought of Kriemhild, of the life he could have with her. The idea of winning her in such a way seemed strange, a far cry from the simple love he had imagined. But what was love in the face of such ambition? What was right when the tides of fate had already been set in motion? When Siegfried and Gunther arrived in Iceland, the sea air was thick with the scent of salt and ice. They were welcomed as honored guests, and yet Siegfried's heart weighed heavy. This was not a land of peace, but of warriors, and their queen, Brunhild, was a woman of war, as fierce as any blade in battle. She stood before them, her eyes like steel, her presence commanding the room. Tall, strong, unyielding, Brunhild was everything Siegfried had heard of and more. She was not a woman to be wooed with soft words or gentle promises. She demanded respect, and she gave none to those who did not earn it. Gunther, hidden behind the mask of Siegfried's identity, stepped forward with a false confidence. He would challenge her, he would defeat her, and he would win her favor. But Brunhild saw through the ruse the moment the challenge was made. There was something about Siegfried's eyes, something that told her that this man was not truly who he claimed to be. And though she could not place it, she knew something was amiss. But there was no turning back now. The challenge had been set. Siegfried, disguised as Gunther, would fight for the right to win Brunhild's love. The court of Iceland watched as the two began their contest of strength, a battle not of fists, but of wills. Brunhild, with her fierce heart, fought with all her might, but Siegfried was unstoppable. His movements were fluid, a dance of power and precision. He was playing a part, but in the process, he had become the embodiment of strength, of honor, of everything that Brunhild might have once sought in a man. In the end, it was not brute force that won the day, but cleverness. Brunhild, impressed by the challenge, agreed to marry Gunther, unaware of the deception that had taken place behind her back. But though she was taken by the show of strength, something deep within her stirred, an unease that would not be shaken. She had been deceived, yes, but her heart would not be so easily swayed. The truth of the matter was far from settled, and the kingdom of Burgundy would soon learn that the love they had sought through trickery would come at a price. Siegfried, standing by the side of his friend, knew that the consequences of this deceit would eventually come crashing down. The fates had been altered, but at what cost? For the hearts of men and women are fragile, and even the greatest strength cannot protect against the wounds of betrayal. The truth had not yet been spoken, but it was already too late to turn back. The world of kings and queens, of warriors and lovers, had been changed in that moment. And though they had won the prize they sought, it was clear that the real battle was only just beginning. The air hung heavy with the weight of destiny. Brunhild stood before them all, the very embodiment of strength. Her gaze swept over the men who dared to challenge her, sharp as the edge of a sword. There was no fear in her eyes, only fire, as if her spirit could not be touched or broken. She had earned her title as queen, not by birthright alone, but by conquering every obstacle that stood in her way, every man who thought he could best her. And now, her trials would begin again. Gunther, with his heart set on her, stepped forward, his mind clouded by ambition and his desire to possess a woman whose strength seemed almost impossible to conquer. Yet he knew that he, himself, was no match for her. She would test him, just as she had tested every suitor before. He would need help, but not just from anyone. He needed Siegfried, whose fame had reached across the lands like the roar of a storm. Siegfried, the man whose strength seemed to rival the gods themselves. But Siegfried, bound by honor and a sense of loyalty to his friend, would do more than help. He would take on the guise of Gunther. For it was not just Gunther's reputation on the line, but something far more precious, the kingdom itself. Brunhild's heart could only be won through strength, and if Gunther could not prove himself, then all hope would be lost. The first trial came like a storm, wild and unrelenting. A contest of strength, the likes of which had never been seen before. The challenge was simple in its concept but brutal in execution. Brunhild stood ready, her hands clenched into fists, the fire of her will burning fiercely in her chest. She would test Gunther's might in a battle of sheer power, throwing a spear to a distance no man had ever reached before. If Gunther could match her strength, he would prove his worth. But Gunther faltered, his hand shaking as he threw his spear. It was nowhere near the mark Brunhild had set. The court of Iceland murmured with disdain, their eyes turning toward the man who would have been their king. Gunther's heart pounded in his chest, not from the challenge, but from the crushing weight of failure. He had not the strength to match Brunhild, nor the courage to face the truth of it. It was then that Siegfried stepped forward, hidden behind the false face of his friend. The crowd watched in confusion, but none knew that the contest had already been won. With a glance, Siegfried took his own spear, his movements fluid and purposeful. With a single throw, he cast the spear farther than Brunhild had ever dreamed. It sailed through the air, a streak of silver light, landing far beyond the mark she had set. The court gasped in awe. Siegfried's strength was unlike anything they had ever seen, and in that moment, Gunther's claim to victory was secured. Brunhild's gaze shifted, narrowing with a touch of suspicion. She had seen the truth in Siegfried's eyes, something she could not ignore. There was more to this than met the eye. But she said nothing, only nodded, her expression unreadable. The second trial was a test of endurance. A tug-of-war between the strongest of men, a challenge of wills to see who could hold the line and who would fall. Gunther stepped forward, his heart heavy, knowing full well that he was no match for Brunhild's power. Yet again, Siegfried took his place, and with a grip like iron, he held the rope as though it were but a thread in his hands. Brunhild tugged with all her might, her strength like the tempest, but Siegfried held firm, his body a rock against the waves. It was as though nothing could move him. Brunhild, who had never known defeat, found herself struggling, her pride wounded by the unknown force that seemed to stand against her. Her hands were slick with sweat, her teeth gritted in frustration. The rope was tight, unyielding. She pulled harder, but Siegfried was not swayed. His muscles, honed by years of training, did not yield, and in the end, it was Brunhild who was forced to relent, stepping back, her heart filled with a quiet rage. But still, she did not speak. She only watched, and in the depths of her eyes, there was a flicker of something darker, a question, an unease. Something was not right, but she could not yet place it. The final trial came swiftly, a test of skill that no man, save for the gods, could hope to master. It was a contest of speed and reflexes, a duel of agility where each combatant would face off in a match of unspoken grace. Gunther stepped forward, hoping against hope that his strength might see him through. But again, he faltered. He was not swift enough, not sharp enough. Once more, it was Siegfried who stood in his place, his movements a blur, his body flowing like water in the river. He danced through the contest, his agility and speed leaving Brunhild in awe. Each movement was calculated, precise, like the stroke of an artist. There was no contest, Siegfried was in a league of his own. But as the final contest came to a close, something shifted in the air. Brunhild's eyes, filled with the anger of a woman scorned, narrowed as she realized the truth. This was not Gunther who had triumphed, but Siegfried. It was not her future husband who had bested her in every trial, but a man whose face wore the mask of another. And in that moment, she understood that she had been deceived. But she did not speak of it, not yet. She merely turned away, her heart a storm of fury and confusion. The room was silent, as though the very air held its breath. Siegfried stood, his chest heaving with the effort of the trials, his victory sealed, yet his heart heavy with guilt. This was not a victory to be celebrated, not when it had been won with deceit. The cost of this triumph was greater than any prize, and the shadows of the consequences were already beginning to stir. Brunhild knew she had been wronged. But she also knew that the story was not finished. What had begun with deception would end in something much darker, something that none of them could foresee. And as the silence stretched, one truth became clear: no contest of strength could stand against the power of a broken heart. The bells tolled, their sound ringing through the valley, echoing off the stone walls of the grand hall. There was an air of festivity, but beneath it, a palpable tension clung to the heavy, fragrant air of the wedding feast. The sun dipped low behind the mountains, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch like fingers of fate. Today was not just any day, today would change everything. Two unions were about to take place, two marriages that would bind not only hearts but kingdoms. Yet there was something about this gathering that felt less like a celebration and more like the gathering of a storm. The weight of what had transpired hung heavily in the air. Gunther, his crown tilted just slightly on his brow, stood at the head of the table, nervously surveying the scene. He had won Brunhild, but at what cost? Brunhild, standing at his side, her face a mask of beauty and stoic composure, gave no outward sign of the storm that raged within her. Her eyes, those fierce, proud eyes, betrayed nothing, but those who looked closely could see the flicker of something darker. Something that spoke of betrayal, of a future she had not chosen. She had been deceived, and while she stood beside Gunther, her mind was far away, calculating, brooding, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally surface. And then there was Kriemhild, radiant and serene, standing beside Siegfried, her heart soaring with the joy of her marriage. She was beautiful, so beautiful that it took the breath away, her golden hair shimmering in the soft light of the hall, her eyes wide with the innocence of love. Kriemhild looked at Siegfried with such adoration that it seemed nothing could break their bond. But in her heart, there was a faint shadow, a quiet voice that whispered of the tension building between her and Brunhild, of the silent struggles that would rise between them, fueled by pride and deception. Siegfried, standing proudly beside Kriemhild, could not shake the unease that settled within him. He had won Kriemhild's heart, but the path to this moment had been paved with lies. His heart was heavy with guilt, knowing that his actions had come at the expense of another woman's happiness. He had helped Gunther win Brunhild's love, but the cost had been more than just the lies of the contest. The truth would one day come to light, and with it, the pain of broken trust would follow. The ceremony itself unfolded like a dream, too perfect, too poised, but it carried with it the promise of darkness to come. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, and the crowd cheered, their voices rising in joyous celebration. Yet, no one could ignore the undercurrent of unease that rippled through the hall. The eyes of the guests shifted from Gunther to Siegfried, from Kriemhild to Brunhild, and in those fleeting moments, the seeds of future sorrow were sown. The feast that followed was a clash of conflicting emotions. Laughter filled the air, but it sounded hollow, as though it were a prelude to a tragedy yet to come. The tables were laden with food, the goblets overflowing with wine, but no matter how much was consumed, it could not mask the truth that simmered just beneath the surface. The marriage of Gunther and Brunhild, the union of power and pride, sat at one end of the hall, while the marriage of Kriemhild and Siegfried, the union of love and innocence, sat at the other. And though they were bound by the same celebratory occasion, they could not have been more different. Brunhild, despite her beauty and grace, remained distant, her thoughts far away from the festivities around her. The deception, the lies that had led her to this point, swirled in her mind like an unforgiving storm. She had been humiliated, but more than that, she had been betrayed, and that wound was one she could never forget. Gunther, oblivious to the weight of his wife's silent suffering, sat beside her, trying to offer comfort with his presence, but nothing he did could ease the tension in her heart. She was trapped, bound by duty to a man she did not love, forced into a marriage she had not chosen. Across the hall, Siegfried could not ignore the fact that his actions had caused this. He had stood beside Gunther and helped him win Brunhild, but now, as he looked across the table at her, he saw only the quiet devastation in her eyes. It was a wound he had helped inflict, and while he sat beside Kriemhild, he could not escape the feeling that this night would mark the beginning of a much darker tale. Kriemhild, ever the picture of happiness, did not yet understand the complexity of what had unfolded. She loved Siegfried with all her heart, but as she looked at Brunhild, something inside her stirred, a flicker of understanding, a silent warning that told her the peace of this day would not last. She was unaware of the storm that raged in Brunhild's heart, unaware of the tragedy that was already beginning to take shape, but the day would come when she would understand all too well. As the night wore on, the celebration continued, but it was no longer a true celebration. It was a dance, a fragile facade, a momentary escape from the inevitable conflict that would come. The wine flowed, the music played, and the court danced, but beneath it all, the tension between the two brides, the two women whose fates were now forever entwined, grew thicker with every passing second. The two marriages, now sealed with vows and rings, were more than mere unions of men and women. They were unions of kingdoms, of power, and of pride. And in the midst of the celebration, the shadow of what would come, the inevitable clash of hearts and wills, loomed large. The future, uncertain and dark, hung over them all, and no one in the hall could shake the feeling that they had been here before, that they were standing on the edge of something terrible. For now, the night continued, but as the music played and the dancers spun, the hearts of all those involved beat with the knowledge that the joy of today would soon give way to the agony of tomorrow. The marriages were not the end of the story, but merely the beginning of the pain, of the betrayal, and of the storm that would tear everything apart. The days had begun to stretch longer, the air heavy with the weight of unsaid things. What had begun as a union of joy and promise now seethed beneath the surface, where tension slowly began to take root. In the halls of the grand castle, laughter still echoed in the corridors, but for those who could feel it, there was an undercurrent of something darker, something unspoken. Brunhild's smile had started to fade, turning brittle and thin like something strained, and Kriemhild, unaware, continued to glow with pride in her marriage. Brunhild could no longer ignore the sharp pang of doubt that gnawed at her, a suspicion creeping steadily into her mind. She had been betrayed, not just by her new husband, Gunther, but by the man who had played the pivotal role in her capture. Siegfried, the one who had tricked her into believing she was in control, the one who had made her compete for love and honor only to leave her standing with the bitter sting of deception. She had been a queen, proud and strong, but now she was trapped in a marriage built on falsehoods. Her gaze often strayed to the sight of Siegfried, who walked through the halls with Kriemhild by his side, so confident, so sure of himself. How could it be? How could the man who had claimed to help her, the one who had been a part of her humiliation, now stand beside the woman who held his heart? Brunhild's eyes, once filled with fire and unyielding strength, now smoldered with an unspoken question. What role had Siegfried truly played in her defeat? Had he not been the one to make it all seem so easy for Gunther? Had he not been the invisible hand, guiding the events that led to her being reduced from a queen to a mere pawn in a game she had never agreed to play? Her heart, a fortress once unshakable, now began to crack with the weight of her suspicions. She had seen it, the sly, knowing glances exchanged between Siegfried and Gunther. Their words, veiled in jest, stung her more than any sword ever could. There was a familiarity there, a bond that went far deeper than any pretense of friendship. She had been used. The thought twisted like a blade inside her chest. And Kriemhild, blissfully unaware, stood beside her husband, her heart swelling with pride at the man she had married. To her, Siegfried was nothing short of a hero, strong, noble, and daring. His victories, his feats, his deeds were tales to be told in song and legend. She spoke of him to anyone who would listen, her voice filled with the warmth of admiration. She didn't see the shadows forming around them, didn't feel the weight of the tension that had begun to shift the air between them. The love that she felt for Siegfried was pure, but in her pride, she had become blind to the truths that were hiding just beyond her sight. Brunhild's heart grew heavier with each passing day, but she kept her suspicions to herself, her gaze turning colder as she looked upon Kriemhild. To her, it was as though Kriemhild walked through the halls with a quiet, unaware arrogance, basking in the sunlight of her husband's glory, while Brunhild was left in the shadows of her own broken pride. She couldn't help but wonder, as Kriemhild glided through the castle in her delicate beauty, if she even knew what kind of man she had married. Did Kriemhild see Siegfried as she did? Did she understand the layers of deception that had brought her to this point? The castle itself seemed to echo with the tension, the walls whispering in the silence between the women. The air was thick, like the calm before a storm. Kriemhild, in her innocence, remained blind to the web of lies that had been woven around her. But as the days turned into weeks, she began to sense the change in the air. A strange chill ran down her spine when she passed Brunhild in the hall, when their eyes met for a brief moment that stretched into eternity. There was something there, something unspoken, something sharp. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she knew that Brunhild was watching her. Watching them. And in those moments, the bond between Kriemhild and Siegfried felt like a fragile thread, trembling in the wind. As the seasons changed, so did the atmosphere within the court. Brunhild's silence spoke volumes. She no longer smiled when she passed Kriemhild, no longer exchanged pleasantries with her, though they were both queens in name. The air between them had thickened into something dense, something unsettling. Kriemhild, in her pride and naivety, could not fathom the depths of the jealousy stirring within Brunhild's heart. She thought it was a passing shadow, a fleeting moment that would fade with time. But the seeds of doubt had been sown, and soon they would grow into something far darker. Brunhild's suspicions, once a quiet whisper in the back of her mind, had begun to take root and grow, intertwining with her pride and her sense of betrayal. Every glance exchanged between Siegfried and Kriemhild felt like a silent affirmation of the injustice she had suffered. Every word spoken in praise of Siegfried felt like a dagger, twisting deeper into her heart. She had been a queen, a woman of power, yet now she was nothing. A mere shadow of what she had once been. And Kriemhild, her joy unmarred by the tension in the air, stood by Siegfried, her heart still full of love and admiration. She did not see the way the air shifted when she walked beside him, did not hear the unspoken words that passed between those who watched them. In her mind, their love was unshakable, their bond eternal. Yet the threads of fate were being spun tighter around them, pulling them toward a future that neither could yet see. The seeds of jealousy had been planted, and now they began to grow, unnoticed by Kriemhild, yet all too visible to Brunhild. The castle, once full of celebration, had become a place of quiet tension, and the bonds between the women, the bonds of love and pride, were being stretched, tested, and ultimately frayed. Neither would know it yet, but the path ahead was fraught with betrayal, with the bitter sting of jealousy, and the quiet unraveling of everything they thought they understood about loyalty and love. What had once been a simple celebration of marriage had become something far darker. And soon, the storm would break. Hagen stood alone in the shadows, the weight of his thoughts pressing heavily on his chest. The flickering light of the torches barely illuminated his stern face, but his eyes were dark, fixed on something far beyond the walls of the castle. He was a man of unshakable resolve, his loyalty to his lord, King Gunther, the one true thing he could never betray. But loyalty, in its purest form, came with its own cost, and Hagen knew that price all too well. He was not a man given to open displays of emotion, not one to second-guess his decisions, but tonight something stirred inside him, something that made his stomach churn with a bitter, unspoken truth. His mind raced back to the moment he had made his vow, to defend Gunther's honor, no matter the cost. It was a vow he had sworn, bound by blood and loyalty, yet it seemed, now, to stretch in a way that made his skin crawl. Siegfried. The hero, the one who had single-handedly turned the tide of battles, the one whose name was whispered with admiration throughout the land. To Hagen, Siegfried was a threat, a shining figure who threatened to eclipse everything Gunther had worked for. He had seen it in the way Kriemhild looked at her husband with awe, in the way Gunther's own stature seemed to shrink in comparison to Siegfried's towering presence. To Hagen, this was not just a matter of pride, it was a matter of survival. Gunther had been a good king, a man of his word, but there were cracks beginning to show. He had promised his sister, Kriemhild, a marriage to the great hero, Siegfried. It was a marriage that should have been filled with joy and prosperity. Yet, Hagen had watched from the sidelines as cracks began to form in the perfect facade of their union. The hero who had slain dragons and conquered kingdoms now stood as a threat to the very kingdom he had helped protect. There was no way to avoid it. Siegfried had become too powerful, and Hagen, ever the pragmatic strategist, knew what had to be done. It was with a quiet resolve that he had decided Siegfried must die. But it wasn't just about power. No, this was about loyalty. Hagen's loyalty to his king was not something to be taken lightly. It was a bond that could not be broken, a duty that ran deeper than friendship, deeper than any personal grudge or bitterness. To betray Gunther's trust, to see his king's name tarnished in the face of a man like Siegfried, was something Hagen could not allow. The king's honor had to be preserved, no matter the cost. And so, the plan took shape in the darkness of his mind, a twisted scheme that would see the great Siegfried brought low. There were no illusions in Hagen's heart. He knew exactly what this would mean. He knew that in carrying out this betrayal, he would be the villain in the eyes of many. There would be no glory for him in this act. There would only be the knowledge that, in his eyes, he had done what was necessary to protect the fragile world they had built. He would be the one to pull the strings, to lay the trap, to bring about Siegfried's downfall. But his loyalty to Gunther, his devotion, demanded it. The first steps of the plan were subtle, hardly noticed by the others. It began with whispers, small manipulations of truth, seeds of doubt planted in the hearts of those closest to Siegfried. Hagen knew how to twist words, how to make a lie seem like the truth. He watched, ever vigilant, as the relationships around him began to fray. He could see it in Kriemhild's gaze, her pride in her husband, but also her increasing vulnerability. She trusted Siegfried blindly, and that made her an easy target. She would never suspect that her beloved husband was being set up, that the very thing she held closest to her heart would be ripped away in the cruelest way possible. But the trap, Hagen knew, was not yet ready. Timing was everything. The kingdom, still reveling in the glow of Siegfried's victories, would need to be lulled into a false sense of security. And then, when the time was right, when the hero's guard was down and his strength had been softened by the flattery of his own image, Hagen would strike. In the meantime, Hagen continued his quiet watch over Gunther, standing as a pillar of support, keeping the king steady, even as the seeds of doubt began to spread. He was careful, calculating, moving pieces into place like a master strategist. Every word, every glance, every action was a thread in the web of his plan. He was not interested in revenge for himself, but in the survival of the kingdom, in the preservation of everything Gunther had built. Siegfried's fate, though, was sealed. Hagen had no illusions about that. He had seen enough of the world to know that power, when left unchecked, always led to ruin. Siegfried had become too powerful, too beloved, and that was dangerous. There was only one way to protect Gunther's reign, and Hagen was willing to sacrifice whatever it took, whether it be his soul, his honor, or the very life of the man he had once called a comrade. As the days wore on, Hagen's heart grew heavier with the weight of the burden he carried. The plan would unfold soon. The moment of betrayal would come, and when it did, there would be no turning back. The kingdom would be shaken to its very foundations. But Hagen, as always, would remain steadfast. His loyalty to Gunther, to the crown, would see him through. He would protect the honor of his king, even if it meant shattering the peace of the kingdom, even if it meant the death of the man who had once stood beside him in battle. The deed was not one he would relish. But in his heart, Hagen knew it was the only choice. There would be no joy in this victory, no triumph in the face of destruction. There would only be the cold, unflinching knowledge that he had done what was necessary. For Gunther. For the kingdom. For the honor that could not be lost. And so, the darkness of his resolve grew ever deeper as the life of Siegfried became something that had to be snuffed out in the name of loyalty. And the storm, though still on the horizon, was inevitable. A cold wind swept across the stone walls of the castle, carrying with it the bitter scent of betrayal. Inside the great hall, the flickering torchlight cast long, wavering shadows, as if the walls themselves could not bear witness to the treachery that was about to unfold. King Gunther sat hunched over, his hands clenched tightly on the table before him. Hagen stood at his side, his face as hard as iron, his eyes cold with determination. The two men were alone, but in that room there was an overwhelming sense that the air had thickened, filled with a weight too heavy to carry. Gunther's voice, when it came, was low, strained. "You understand, don't you, Hagen? There is no choice. This is the only way." His words were as sharp as a dagger, and the weight of them seemed to hang in the air like the threat of an impending storm. Hagen nodded, his jaw set, and his heart as stone. He had always been loyal to Gunther, to his kingdom, and to the bonds that had once united them all. But loyalty, he knew, was not without its cost. He had long since accepted that some things were more important than friendship. And Gunther, who had been a brother in arms, a man who had trusted him with his life, had made it clear that his kingdom, his throne, and his honor must be protected at any cost. Even if that cost was the life of a friend. Siegfried had once been the hero, the shining light who had saved them all. But now, in the bitter winds of jealousy and power, Siegfried had become a threat. A threat not just to Gunther's reign, but to everything they had fought for. His strength, his bravery, his very presence overshadowed them all. And that, to Gunther and Hagen, had become unacceptable. "I never wanted this," Gunther's voice cracked, revealing a crack in the facade he had built around himself. "But he has to die. For the good of the kingdom. For the good of my reign." Hagen's gaze hardened, his thoughts dark and unreadable. He had seen the change in Gunther over the years, the rise of Siegfried, the way his power had made Gunther feel small. The envy that had started as a whisper in the king's heart had grown louder, and now it demanded action. The time had come, and they could no longer deny it. "You're right," Hagen replied, his voice like gravel. "There is no other way. But the blood oath between us. It's a bond one never thought we would break." His eyes flickered toward Gunther, a fleeting moment of doubt crossing his face before the walls went up again. "Siegfried was our brother." Gunther did not look up. He had already made up his mind. The betrayal was already in motion, and there was no turning back. A brother who has grown too strong. A brother who threatens everything we've built. A brother who needs to be removed. The weight of the words settled between them like a stone, and for a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence was deafening, thick with the gravity of their decision. There had been a time when they had fought side by side, when Siegfried's sword had been as much theirs as his own. But now, their unity felt like a distant memory, replaced by a new alliance, an alliance born not of friendship, but of power. Gunther had chosen to break the bond, and Hagen had pledged to carry it out. Gunther finally looked up, his face pale, the strain of his decision evident in the lines etched into his skin. "We'll take him down, Hagen. I'll need you. This is not just for me, it's for the future of the kingdom." Hagen met his gaze, but inside, he felt something stir, a cold, gnawing emptiness. A voice whispered at the edges of his mind, a voice that told him this was wrong. He had betrayed too much to come this far, and yet he was unable to turn away. Gunther needed him. The kingdom needed him. The oath they had taken was sacred, and to break it now was unthinkable. But still, he had no choice. "It will be done," Hagen said, his voice devoid of emotion. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph in his words. Only the quiet, solemn promise of a man who had made his peace with the darkness. The plan was set. The trap would be laid. The next days were filled with whispered plans, veiled threats, and the growing tension of an empire on the brink. Gunther and Hagen worked in the shadows, pulling strings with careful precision. The web of deceit they wove was masterful, and though Siegfried was still blissfully unaware, the end was coming for him, slowly, quietly, but surely. The blood oath that had once bound them together was now shattered, broken into pieces like glass. And as Gunther and Hagen turned against the man who had once been their comrade, the pieces of their friendship scattered in all directions, never to be repaired. Gunther's kingdom was important, yes. But so was his pride. His fear of being overshadowed by Siegfried had finally overtaken him, and in the twisted logic of his mind, this betrayal was necessary. Hagen's own loyalty to the king was undying, and though his heart felt torn in the quiet moments, he knew there was no other way. The kingdom had to remain strong, and that meant silencing the hero who threatened to take it all away. Siegfried's death would come soon. The betrayal was imminent. And with each passing day, the weight of their treachery grew heavier on their souls. They had chosen this path, and now they had to walk it, no matter where it led. In the end, there would be no joy in their victory, no satisfaction in the blood they would spill. Only the cold, hollow knowledge that loyalty, once pure, had been broken beyond repair. And so, the moment of reckoning drew ever closer. There would be no turning back from the blood that would be shed. No redemption for the bonds they had destroyed. Only the grim realization that what they had done could never be undone. The sky was heavy, the clouds thick and brooding, casting a dark, oppressive shadow over the forest. It seemed as if the trees themselves stood silently, watching, waiting. The air was still, too still, as though even nature knew something terrible was about to unfold. The sound of hooves echoed in the distance, the rhythmic beat growing louder as the hunters rode closer, their figures emerging through the mist that clung to the ground like a veil of secrecy. Siegfried rode at the front, his eyes keen and alert, his sharp instincts telling him the hunt would be anything but ordinary today. He was used to the wild, used to the thrill of the chase, but something felt different this time. A creeping sense of unease curled at the edges of his mind, a nagging whisper that he couldn't quite silence. Still, he shook it off. The forest was his domain, and nothing had ever truly been able to catch him off guard. He was Siegfried, the dragon slayer, the unconquerable hero. What could possibly harm him in the woods? Behind him, Gunther and Hagen rode quietly, their faces hidden beneath the hoods of their cloaks. Their silence was deafening. But it wasn't the silence of camaraderie. No, it was the silence of betrayal, of a plan set into motion, hidden beneath the veneer of friendship and shared sport. They had brought him here, into the heart of the forest, to end his life. The very man who had once been their brother was now the target of their scheming. But Siegfried, for all his might and power, was unaware of the treachery awaiting him. The horses moved through the trees, the leaves rustling faintly as they passed. The tension in the air thickened with every step. Siegfried could feel it now, the prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the sudden quiet in the forest. But still, he couldn't place it. He urged his horse forward, not knowing that every beat of his heart was bringing him closer to the trap. Then, the rustle of branches ahead caught his attention. A deer, large and sleek, leaped from the underbrush, its hooves striking the earth with the grace of a shadow. Siegfried's instincts kicked in, and he spurred his horse, chasing after it with ease. But as he tore through the forest, there was something off about the way the world seemed to close in on him. The trees, once a welcoming shelter, now seemed to loom, their branches twisting like fingers reaching out to grab him. Siegfried pushed forward, the thrill of the chase dulling the strange feeling in his chest. He was unstoppable, as always. His blade was sharp, his resolve unyielding. But what he didn't know was that the trap had already been set. And the moment he gave chase, the snare was sprung. Gunther's voice, quiet and cold, broke the silence. Now. It was a single word, but it held the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises. Hagen's eyes gleamed with dark intent as he raised his bow, pulling the string taut. The arrow, laced with poison, was ready to be loosed. And in that moment, as Siegfried's back was turned, as he focused solely on the deer before him, the arrow flew. It cut through the air with deadly precision, striking its mark. The poison, swift and unyielding, surged through Siegfried's body before he even had a chance to react. The world seemed to slow as the great hero felt the first sting of betrayal. He staggered, his grip on the reins faltering, as the poison spread like fire through his veins. His vision blurred, and for a moment, the forest around him seemed to spin. The sounds of hooves grew distant, and the weight of the world seemed to press down on him. Siegfried tried to turn his horse, tried to call out, but his throat was tight, his voice a mere rasp. His hand gripped the hilt of his sword, but even that felt distant, foreign. The world was slipping away from him, and with it, the burning realization that those he had once called friends, those he had trusted with his very life, had betrayed him. Gunther and Hagen approached, their eyes cold, their expressions unreadable. Gunther looked at Siegfried, his face a mask of guilt and resolve. He had done this for the kingdom, for his throne, but even now, as Siegfried's strength faltered, a small voice inside him questioned the cost of it all. Siegfried, swaying in his saddle, tried to lift his head, to meet the eyes of those who had once stood by him. He wanted to ask them why had they done this? But the words wouldn't come. The poison was too strong, and the world around him was dimming, as if the very light of the forest had been snuffed out. Hagen was the first to speak, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's over, Siegfried." His words were like a death knell, ringing out in the silence of the woods. "Your time has come." Siegfried tried to respond, to fight, but the poison was too much. His body betrayed him, and as he slumped from his horse, the ground seemed to rise up to meet him. His sword slipped from his grasp, his vision narrowing until all he could see was darkness. Gunther watched, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. He had wanted to protect his kingdom, to hold on to his power. But in that moment, as he looked down at the great hero who had once stood beside him, he couldn't escape the feeling that something had been lost forever. The brotherhood, the friendship, the trust they had shared, all of it was gone, shattered in an instant. Siegfried lay there in the dirt, the poison coursing through his veins, his body growing still. His once unshakable strength had been defeated by treachery, and the man who had slayed dragons and defeated gods now lay broken, his life slipping away. The forest stood silent once more, the only sound the distant whisper of the wind through the trees. The hunt was over, but the blood spilled in the clearing would echo through time, a reminder of the betrayal that had claimed the life of a hero. The air was thick with tension as the sun began to set, casting long, haunting shadows across the land. The sky was an eerie mixture of blood red and purple, as though it had been stained by the weight of the tragedy that was about to unfold. The weight of betrayal hung heavy in the air, thickening the silence with an almost unbearable heaviness. Siegfried, still the mighty hero, stood tall and proud, but something had changed in him. He had conquered so many challenges, faced impossible odds, and emerged victorious each time, yet now, as the world around him seemed to shift, there was no escaping the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control. The winds howled softly through the trees, as though warning him, but his heart was too full of faith in his friends to listen. He had trusted them all, believed they would stand with him forever. But trust, like glass, shatters easily. Hagen stood just a few steps away, his gaze dark and calculating, his face masked in a twisted, unreadable expression. His hands, once steady and strong, were now trembling ever so slightly as he tightened his grip on the spear. He had made his choice. His loyalty lay with Gunther, and the price for that loyalty was Siegfried's life. His heart, once warm with shared triumphs and victories, had turned cold with ambition and greed. What had once been a bond of brotherhood was now a thin thread, soon to snap in the cruelest of ways. Siegfried didn't see it coming. He never imagined that one of his own, one he had fought beside, one he had shared laughter and blood with, would turn on him. Not like this. Not so suddenly, so sharply. The spear that Hagen wielded had no honor, no noble purpose. It was a weapon of betrayal. The air seemed to grow thicker around them, as if the earth itself held its breath in anticipation of what was about to happen. In that final moment, time seemed to stand still for Siegfried. He had known danger in every form, from dragons to warriors, but this was different. The knife edge of destiny had come for him, and it was not a beast or a battle he could conquer. It was treachery, cruel and silent, that would end his life. Hagen moved swiftly, his steps measured and quiet, his eyes never leaving Siegfried's back. The hero, unaware of the betrayal lurking behind him, continued to walk, a proud man unaware of the blow that would steal his life. Hagen raised his spear, eyes glinting with dark resolve. And then, it happened. With one swift motion, Hagen thrust the spear forward, a deadly arc that struck Siegfried's vulnerable back, the only part of him not protected by his dragon-slaying armor. The world seemed to stop. For a moment, Siegfried stood frozen, the realization of what had just happened creeping into his mind, like ice running through his veins. His body, once the embodiment of strength and invulnerability, suddenly became limp, betraying him as the pain of the wound surged through his chest. The sound of the spear sinking into his flesh was a sharp, horrific crack that rang out in the silence of the clearing, echoing the finality of what was occurring. It was as if the world itself mourned the loss of something precious, something irreplaceable. Siegfried gasped, his breath coming in shallow, desperate gasps. He turned, his eyes locking with Hagen's, searching for answers, for some semblance of understanding. But there was no mercy in Hagen's gaze, only coldness, the steel of betrayal as sharp as the spear still lodged in his side. The hero, who had faced dragons, gods, and death itself, crumbled in that moment, not from the wound, but from the unbearable weight of the betrayal. The ground beneath him seemed to give way, the earth eager to claim the life of a man who had been too trusting, too sure of his invulnerability. His knees buckled, and he fell to the dirt, the forest now a cruel, silent witness to his downfall. In the distance, the wind howled again, as if to carry the cries of the man who had been torn apart not by an enemy's sword, but by the hands of his closest allies. The world felt cold, indifferent. There was no glory in this death, no heroic last stand, just the crushing, bitter taste of treason. As Siegfried lay there, his life slipping away, there was one face that came to mind. Kriemhild, his beloved wife, who had waited for him so faithfully, who had believed in his invincibility. The thought of her made his heart ache. He had promised her forever, and now, he couldn't keep that promise. The agony of that thought was worse than the wound itself. The blood flowed, pooling beneath him, staining the ground with the life he had once given so freely to the world. But now, as his breaths grew weaker, the blood felt heavy with the sorrow of a broken trust. His vision blurred, the edges of his world fading into darkness. And in the midst of it all, Kriemhild's name echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of the love that would never be fulfilled. The betrayal, the loss, the grief, it all crushed him in ways 1,000 battles could never have. But even in the depths of his pain, the shadow of Hagen's treachery remained. The man who had sworn loyalty, the man who had shared the spoils of victory, had now become the instrument of his destruction. Hagen stood over him, expression cold, his gaze never faltering. There were no words. There was only the finality of what had been done. As Siegfried's life drained away, he thought of Kriemhild. He wanted to speak her name, to call out to her, to warn her of the sorrow that was about to descend upon her, but his voice was gone, swallowed by the thick blood filling his throat. Kriemhild. The woman he had loved with all his heart, the woman who had been the light of his world. She would never know the truth. She would never know that it was not just fate that claimed him, but the very man he had trusted most. And as his breath slowed, the last thing he felt was the unbearable weight of that unspoken truth. He would die without her ever knowing the depth of his love, and the depth of his betrayal. And then, the light left his eyes, the world went still, and Siegfried, the dragon slayer, the hero of 1,000 battles, was no more. The night was silent, but the air was thick with tension, like a storm waiting to break. The Nibelung treasure lay hidden in the darkened vault, its gold gleaming faintly in the dim light, untouched by time, yet cursed by the bloodshed it had witnessed. The treasure was more than just gold and jewels, it was a symbol of power, a symbol of betrayal. A possession coveted by all but held by none with true peace in their hearts. Kriemhild, once radiant with love and hope, now stood over the treasure with empty eyes, her thoughts tangled in grief and vengeance. Her heart, shattered by the brutal death of Siegfried, had slowly hardened, and now, the treasure seemed to be the only thing that could restore the honor stolen from her. She had dreams of using it, not just for herself, but to avenge Siegfried's murder. She could feel the weight of it in her hands, and with it, the power to make the world right again. But the world she thought she knew was crumbling beneath her feet. And in the shadows, hidden from her view, lurked a man with his own plans. Hagen von Tronje, ever loyal to Gunther, had no intention of letting Kriemhild lay claim to the treasure. To him, it was not just a pile of wealth, it was the one thing that could undo him. For Kriemhild, now broken and consumed by her need for justice, was the only one left who had the power to bring ruin upon him. And Hagen, with his cold, calculating mind, would stop at nothing to keep her from gaining that power. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly as Hagen moved toward the treasure with deliberate steps, his mind set on one singular goal, to take it before Kriemhild could use it against him. He didn't care for the treasure's worth, he cared only for the control it gave him. As long as the gold and jewels stayed in his grasp, no one, not even Kriemhild, could touch him. The darkness was his ally as he reached the hidden vault, the treasure beckoning to him like a siren's call. He could almost hear its whisper, calling him to take it, to claim it, to protect himself from what he feared most. He knew that the moment Kriemhild gained the treasure, her vengeance would have no bounds. She would stop at nothing to destroy the man who had slain her husband, and Hagen would be at the top of her list. His heart raced with a mixture of fear and greed as he glanced toward the gleaming hoard. His hands trembled, but only for a moment. This was what had to be done. He had already sacrificed everything for Gunther. His loyalty was unwavering, but now it was time to protect what he had left, his life, his power, and his future. Hagen had always believed that to succeed in this world, one had to be ruthless, willing to discard all ties of friendship, loyalty, and even love for the sake of survival. He had learned this lesson long ago, and it had brought him to this moment. With a swift motion, he swept the treasure into his hands, the cold weight of it pressing into his skin, the gold a sharp contrast to the darkness that surrounded him. As he turned to leave, the treasure clutched tightly in his arms, a shadow crossed his path. Kriemhild appeared in the doorway, her eyes filled with a burning anger. The treasure was hers, but it was already too late. "You think you can just take it from me?" Her voice was low and full of venom, her grief now transformed into a sharp edge that could cut through anything in its path. The words echoed in the chamber, bouncing off the stone walls, and in that moment, Hagen felt the weight of what he had done settle deep in his bones. Kriemhild took a step forward, her eyes never leaving the treasure. Hagen's breath caught in his throat, and for the briefest of moments, he questioned whether he had made the right choice. But there was no going back now. The treasure was his, and Kriemhild could do nothing to take it from him. "You will regret this," Kriemhild whispered, her voice shaking with rage and sorrow. "This treasure will not save you. It will only bring destruction." Hagen could feel the truth of her words, but he pushed it away, burying his doubts beneath his ambition. He had made his decision. There was no turning back now. He had to keep the treasure, for his sake, for Gunther's sake, for his future. Without another word, Hagen turned and fled, the weight of the treasure pulling him down as he moved through the darkness. The treasure, the one thing that had caused so much pain, so much betrayal, was now his to protect. He could feel Kriemhild's eyes on his back, and in that moment, he understood something. She would never forgive him for what he had done. But even so, the treasure was safe with him, for now. Kriemhild stood frozen in the doorway, her heart breaking in a way she had never known before. The treasure, once a symbol of hope for her, now lay out of reach, its power stolen by the very man who had helped destroy everything she had loved. Her grief for Siegfried, her desire for vengeance, all felt meaningless now. Hagen had taken it all, the treasure, her chance for revenge, and any hope she had left for peace. The night was still, save for the sound of her breath, ragged and uneven. It was as though the world had stopped moving, holding its breath in the face of the betrayal that had just occurred. Kriemhild could feel the pain in her chest, the weight of it suffocating her. She had trusted him, just as she had trusted so many others. But now, there was only darkness ahead. As Hagen disappeared into the night, clutching the treasure, the world seemed to grow colder, crueler, and more unforgiving. The price of ambition had been paid, and there would be no going back. Kriemhild's loss, her grief, her anger, they would fuel her next steps. She would not let this betrayal stand. And so, with the treasure now out of her reach, Kriemhild's heart hardened further, and the fire of vengeance began to burn more fiercely than ever. The world was about to change, and those who had wronged her would soon know the cost of their actions. The morning sky, once bright with the promise of a new day, now hung heavy over Burgundy, a dull gray like the weight in everyone's hearts. It was a sky that seemed to press down on the earth, as though nature itself mourned what had already been set into motion. The curse was here, a dark cloud slowly spreading its tendrils across the land, and with it came the slow, insidious poisoning of everything it touched. It started small, almost imperceptible. A rumor here, a misstep there. But soon, the effects began to seep into every corner of the kingdom. The once thriving court of Burgundy, once a place of grandeur and splendor, now felt like a shadow of itself. The laughter and joy had been replaced with nervous whispers, a strange tension hanging thick in the air, the kind of tension that grows when trust is shattered, when betrayal becomes more than just a feeling. It becomes a living thing. The treasure, that cursed hoard of gold and jewels, had been stolen, and with it, the hope that it might bring the power and peace Kriemhild longed for. Instead, the very thing that was meant to restore her honor had begun to unravel the fabric of Burgundy itself. The curse was not just a fairy tale or an old wives' tale, it was real, and it had begun its work. The land, the people, the very hearts of those who once stood tall and proud were now twisted in suspicion and fear. The first signs of the curse's effect were subtle. A sickly crop here and there, fields that once flourished with the promise of abundance now barren. The animals, once healthy and strong, became weak and sickly, their eyes hollow, their movements sluggish. The once sturdy buildings began to crack, their foundations seemingly eroded by some unseen force. No one could see the curse, but they could feel it, the oppressive weight of misfortune pressing in from all sides, suffocating everything in its path. Gunther, who had once ruled with confidence, now found himself staring into the mirror of his own doubts. Was he truly in control? Was the throne still his, or had something else, something darker, already claimed it? The unease gnawed at him, chipping away at his sense of self. He could no longer sleep peacefully. Every sound in the night was a potential threat, every shadow a possible danger. The very air seemed to whisper to him of doom, and he could not escape the feeling that something was wrong, that the world was slowly falling apart at the seams. Hagen, ever the schemer, was no stranger to the weight of paranoia. He had lived in the shadows for so long that he thrived there, and yet, even he began to feel the heavy pressure of the curse. The treasure, now locked away with him, had brought him nothing but fear. His grip on the kingdom seemed tighter than ever, but his heart, a heart once so full of cunning ambition, began to shrink under the weight of his actions. Could he truly protect himself from the curse he had helped unleash? The treasure he had stolen, once a symbol of victory, now seemed like an anchor, dragging him deeper into a pit of his own making. Kriemhild, the woman who had once held hope in her hands, now stood on the edge of a precipice. Her grief over Siegfried's death had already cracked her spirit, and now, the curse that followed the treasure only deepened her sense of loss. But more than that, it burned her with the bitter realization that she had been wrong. She had wanted justice, but what she had received was destruction. The world around her had crumbled in a way that even she could not fix. The treasure had done nothing to restore Siegfried, nothing to repair the rift between her and her family. It had only brought ruin to everything it touched. As the days wore on, Burgundy began to decay. The once proud city that had stood as a testament to the greatness of the Burgundian kings now felt like a hollow shell, its streets echoing with the footsteps of those who no longer knew what they were walking toward. People whispered in corners, casting suspicious glances at one another, wondering who was to blame for the curse that had begun to take hold of the land. Even the most loyal of subjects began to question their leaders, wondering if Gunther and Hagen, the men who had brought this treasure into their lives, had also brought with it the doom they now faced. The court, once a place of celebration, had turned into a pit of anxiety. Every banquet, every meeting, now carried the weight of suspicion. Who among them was the true cause of the suffering? Who had betrayed them all? Everyone looked over their shoulders, wondering if their closest allies were secretly their greatest threats. And it wasn't just the men of the court who felt the effects, the women too, Kriemhild most of all, felt the sting of betrayal in every passing moment. She had dreamed of reclaiming her honor, but now, even her deepest hopes felt like a distant memory. Nothing she had done had worked. Her vengeance had only brought more pain. The curse seemed to take root in the hearts of the people, infecting their every action. Misfortune wasn't just in the crops or the livestock, it was in the very air they breathed, in the way their relationships soured, in the way they looked at each other as though the smallest misstep could bring them to ruin. Every shadow became a threat, every glance a judgment. No one could escape the suffocating grip of fear. Gunther, once proud and strong, could no longer look at his reflection without seeing the man he feared he had become, weak, paranoid, lost. The kingdom he had inherited seemed to slip through his fingers, as though the treasure had cursed him as much as it had cursed the land. Every corner of the kingdom felt tainted. Every step he took was a step deeper into the abyss. As the curse continued to spread, Burgundy was consumed by the growing darkness. The once hopeful land, filled with beauty and promise, now stood as a shadow of itself. The people could feel it, the cold grip of fate tightening around their necks, pulling them toward a future they could not escape. The curse had not just touched the treasure, it had touched their very souls. And with it, the fear that nothing could ever be the same again. And so, Burgundy trembled under the weight of the curse, a kingdom on the brink of collapse, consumed by its own guilt, greed, and betrayal. The misery was tangible, each passing day a reminder of how far they had fallen. And in the distance, just beyond the horizon, the storm that had begun with the treasure's curse was still brewing, its fury waiting to be unleashed. The quiet sound of Kriemhild's breath was the only thing that could be heard in the darkness of the room, her eyes closed, but her mind wide awake, haunted by the memories of the man she had lost. The weight of grief settled heavily on her chest, pressing down until she could hardly breathe. Every day, every hour, she replayed the moment of Siegfried's death. His body crumpling to the ground, the flash of betrayal in his eyes as he looked at her, and the sharp pain that cut through her soul as she knew it was too late to save him. For days, she remained in that dark space of mourning, consumed by loss. She could feel his absence in everything around her, the empty spaces, the silence, the coldness where once there had been warmth. She could still hear his laugh, the sound of his voice, and in the quiet moments of reflection, it felt as though she could reach out and touch him. But no matter how hard she tried, he was gone. The world had taken him from her, and there was nothing left but an aching, unfillable void. But as the grief settled into the bones of her being, something began to stir inside her, a flicker, small at first, but growing with every passing moment. The pain twisted inside her, and slowly, it began to change shape. Grief, so pure and raw at first, was beginning to shift. It turned from sadness into something darker, something sharper, something that clung to her like the very air she breathed. She felt it in her hands, her heart, and her mind. The sharp edges of pain were becoming something else, something dangerous. She could no longer just mourn. She could no longer just weep. Kriemhild had been a woman of grace, a queen in every sense of the word. But now, that same grace was becoming cold steel, tempered by the fire of rage. Her thoughts turned to vengeance, as natural as breathing. The soft tears of a grieving wife had turned into the cold determination of a woman wronged, a woman who had lost everything to the cruel hands of betrayal. The pain inside her was no longer a quiet, private sorrow. It was a roaring fire, consuming everything and leaving nothing but a thirst for justice, or rather, revenge. She had been stripped of her happiness. Her love had been stolen from her in the most brutal of ways. But what if the world had taken her strength, too? What if it had taken everything, but it had not taken her will? She would not allow it. The men who had taken Siegfried from her would pay. Her hands trembled as she picked up the sword, its cool weight pressing against her palms. It was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of everything she had lost. Everything that had been taken from her. The sword that had once symbolized her connection to Siegfried now felt like the tool she needed to carry out her vengeance. She would take back what was hers, no matter the cost. Her thoughts swirled in a violent storm. She could still see the faces of those who had betrayed her, the ones who had smiled, lied, and whispered behind her back. Hagen, Gunther, all of them. They had thought her grief would break her. They had underestimated her. They had taken her husband, but they would not take her spirit. No, not her spirit. That would be theirs to break. Every memory of Siegfried, every moment they had shared, now felt like the sharp sting of a dagger. He had been the light in her life, and now that light was extinguished. But instead of allowing the darkness to swallow her, Kriemhild let it fuel her. Let it transform her into something no longer fragile, no longer helpless. She was no longer a grieving widow, she was a force. A force bent on making the world feel the weight of its injustice. The days that followed were filled with a cold determination. Kriemhild moved through the halls of the palace like a shadow, her eyes sharp and distant, no longer reflecting the sorrow that had once been there. She no longer cried. The tears had been replaced by a hard resolve. She spoke little, her words clipped, as if each one took everything she had to give. She focused all her energy on one singular goal, revenge. The kingdom itself seemed to shrink around her as the walls of her heart began to close in, fortified by her growing rage. Kriemhild could hear the whispers of the court, their fearful voices unsure of what was happening to their queen. The woman who had once been gentle and loving now walked with a new purpose, and it was a purpose that left no room for forgiveness, no room for mercy. Those who had wronged her would answer, and the answers would come in the form of retribution. She began to sharpen her own blade, her mind, her plans, her hatred. It was a dangerous thing, the way vengeance clung to her. It was more than just a thirst for justice, it was a need that could not be satisfied until the blood of her enemies had been spilled. She practiced in the quiet hours of the night, when no one could see, when there were no more distractions. Every stroke of the blade was a prayer for justice, every strike a promise to herself, she would not let the death of Siegfried be in vain. And yet, as her desire for vengeance grew, so did the burden on her soul. Kriemhild knew that vengeance would not bring Siegfried back. It would not undo the pain. But what choice did she have? How could she live in a world where the men who had killed him walked free, unpunished? The grief was still there, but it had become something sharper, something that cut through the fog of sorrow, replacing the quiet ache with an unrelenting drive. She had once believed in the power of love, the healing touch of time. But time had done nothing to heal her heart. The grief had grown and festered, morphing into something darker. What she had once viewed as a beautiful, tender bond with Siegfried had now become a weapon she would use to bring those responsible to their knees. The world had stolen her happiness, and now it would know her fury. With each passing day, Kriemhild's transformation became more complete. She was no longer the gentle woman who had once waited in anticipation for her husband's return. She had become a queen driven by vengeance, a woman who would stop at nothing to make her enemies pay. The sweetness of love had been replaced by the bitterness of betrayal, and it was that bitterness that would fuel her every action from that moment on. And though her heart had been broken, she would see to it that no one was ever allowed to forget the price of taking what was hers. The fire of her grief had turned to a roaring flame of vengeance, and there was no stopping it now. The air around Kriemhild was thick with the tension of the moment. The throne room gleamed with the heavy weight of power and politics. On one side of the room stood Etzel, the mighty king of the Huns, his presence almost suffocating in its grandeur. His gaze was sharp, but his expression held something else, perhaps curiosity or perhaps the desire to make this alliance into something more than a mere union of convenience. Across from him, Kriemhild stood tall, her posture proud, but her eyes were anything but soft. She was a woman with a plan, and this marriage was her key. When Kriemhild had first heard whispers of Etzel's proposal, the bitter taste of anger still lingered in her soul. She had lost Siegfried, the man she had loved with all her heart. And yet, here she was, standing before a man who would never be able to replace him. No one could. But this union was not for love. It was for revenge. It was for justice. It was for something far more important than a fleeting moment of happiness. In this room, Kriemhild was not just a grieving widow. She was no longer the fragile woman who had been shattered by the brutal loss of Siegfried. She had hardened, her heart locked away behind walls of steel, and Etzel was nothing but a pawn in her larger, unstoppable plan. She could feel his gaze on her, the weight of his power pressing down on her shoulders, but she barely noticed. Her focus was elsewhere, on the man who had betrayed her, on the kingdom she would destroy, on the future that would belong to her alone. Etzel had not known her before Siegfried's death. To him, Kriemhild was an enigmatic beauty, a woman whose sorrow was evident in her eyes, but whose ambition now radiated with a fierce intensity. To him, this was an alliance, one of power, one of opportunity. But to Kriemhild, this was her chance to use the might of Etzel and his warriors to achieve what she had dreamed of for so long, vengeance against the men who had taken everything from her. The wedding ceremony was grand, with banners flying high and trumpets blaring across the land. The celebrations were loud, but the silence in Kriemhild's heart was deafening. She moved through the crowd, her steps measured and deliberate, never letting her emotions show. She was the queen now, but she was also a woman with a singular purpose. She was no longer a wife, she was a widow who would let nothing stand in her way. As Etzel took her hand and led her through the grand halls of his fortress, the thought of what lay ahead did not escape her. Her mind raced with the plans she had already begun to form. She would use this alliance, this marriage to Etzel, not for love, but for power. Her enemies, the ones who had murdered Siegfried, would see her rise, and they would understand that Kriemhild was no longer the fragile woman they had once known. Etzel's people, fierce warriors of the Huns, respected her with an intensity that matched her own. They had heard the whispers of the great Kriemhild, the woman who had stood tall even in the face of unimaginable grief. They knew she was not to be underestimated. And though Kriemhild played the part of a dutiful wife, her thoughts were elsewhere. With every passing day, she worked to solidify her position, using Etzel's name and his army to fuel her desires. She knew the price of her ambition. She had already paid it. As Kriemhild looked at her new life, her heart felt numb. She could not allow herself the luxury of grieving for Siegfried now. There was no room for weakness in this new world she had chosen for herself. Her eyes met Etzel's, and in his gaze, she saw nothing but cold calculation. He was a man who had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms, a king who knew power and had come to seek more. Kriemhild knew that she would never love him. He was not Siegfried. But Etzel held the key to her future. Through him, she would bring down the walls that had imprisoned her heart, and through him, she would strike at those who had caused her pain. The days that followed their marriage were a blur of political maneuvering, as Kriemhild carefully plotted the downfall of her enemies. She spoke to Etzel's generals in quiet tones, always careful to plant the seeds of distrust and fear where they needed to grow. She was not content to simply sit by while the world moved around her. No, she would move the pieces herself, one at a time. The men who had betrayed her were no longer safe in their palaces, hidden behind their walls of gold. They were about to learn what it meant to face Kriemhild, the widow who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Etzel's strength was unquestioned. But Kriemhild's was sharper, colder, and more dangerous than any blade. She could feel it in the very air around her, the weight of her intentions, the unstoppable pull of her resolve. This marriage to Etzel had been a calculated move, and she had played her part well. But even as she worked behind the scenes, even as she manipulated every moment, she knew that nothing in this world would ever fill the hole that Siegfried's death had left in her heart. The man she had loved would never come back, and no amount of power, no amount of revenge, could change that. Still, there was something about the cold, calculating way in which she moved through her new life that allowed her to ignore the aching wound in her chest. Every day she spent in Etzel's halls, every moment she spent by his side, she felt the burn of her loss and the hunger for retribution flare once more. She knew that she had given up the possibility of peace. The price of vengeance was high, and she had already paid it. She would never be able to undo what had been done. But there was no turning back. Her path had been set the moment they took Siegfried from her, and now it was a path that would lead her to power, to destruction, to the fulfillment of everything she had longed for in the darkest corners of her heart. Etzel might have been the king, but Kriemhild was the true force behind the throne. She had played her part well, and in the end, it was her cunning that would determine the fate of the kingdom. The fire that had once been grief was now a burning inferno, consuming everything in its path. Nothing would stop her now. Not even Etzel. The throne room in Etzel's court was a place of shadow and light, a space where power pulsed through every stone and whispered through the thick tapestries hanging on the walls. There were no gilded halls here, no shining floors or delicate tapestries like those Kriemhild had known in Burgundy. The air was heavy with the scent of burning wood and the weight of centuries-old customs, foreign yet strangely fitting to Kriemhild's vengeful soul. The room echoed with the laughter and the rough voices of Etzel's warriors, men with faces as hard as iron, their eyes cold yet burning with fierce loyalty to their king. Kriemhild, her eyes cold and calculating, stood at the heart of it all, though she was still a stranger in this world. She had been swept from the comforts of Burgundy to this raw, unrefined court, a kingdom far removed from the polished elegance of her homeland. The contrast was sharp, biting. Burgundy had been a kingdom of beauty, culture, and fine art, its noble houses brimming with decency, its halls adorned with the elegance of high society. There, Kriemhild had been a queen in the truest sense, admired, cherished, a woman who moved with grace and ease through courtly life. But here, in Etzel's kingdom, the sharp edges of a different kind of life were all too apparent. Etzel's warriors, scarred and hardened by battle, had no time for courtesies. They were men of war, men whose strength lay in their ability to wield weapons, to break enemies in battle, and to drink deeply in the revelry that followed their victories. The tables were rough-hewn, the flags that hung from the ceiling heavy with the weight of battle cries rather than symbols of prosperity. It was a kingdom born in the fires of conflict, shaped by the harsh realities of survival. They lived for war, for power, for strength. There was no softness here. Kriemhild watched as Etzel's court bustled around her, men and women shouting across the room, laughing, making deals in the shadows. It was a kingdom where words were as sharp as blades, where promises could be broken with little more than a flick of the wrist. She saw the men glance at her occasionally, their expressions unreadable, their gazes heavy with expectation. They did not see the widow who mourned the death of her husband. They saw a queen, a woman who had come to Etzel's kingdom for reasons far beyond the obvious. Here, she was not a grieving woman, she was an ally, a force. But she could feel the weight of the differences between herself and the people around her. This was not the refined Burgundy, where conversation was laced with politeness, and the steps of the nobles were measured with care. No, this was a land of warriors, where words were earned with blood, and respect was not given, but fought for. She felt the stares of the women here, eyes hard and judgmental. This was a court that did not speak of love or art, it spoke of power and the price of betrayal. The contrast between the lands of Burgundy and Etzel's kingdom was more than just physical, it was cultural. Burgundy had been built on the backs of kings and queens, lords and ladies who held their heads high and draped themselves in silk. The court had been about refinement, sophistication, and the exchange of delicate favors. But Etzel's court was raw. The people were built from the dirt of the land, the sweat of hard labor, and the steel of endless battles. It was a kingdom that wore its scars proudly, a place where each person had earned their right to sit at the table through sheer willpower and bloodshed. This was not the place for subtlety or whispers behind the curtains. Etzel's court was a place where the truth was shouted, where pride was not measured in wealth, but in the strength of your arm and the sharpness of your mind. It was a world where Kriemhild could no longer afford to hide behind the soft, polished exterior of her former life. Kriemhild stood tall, but even now, she could feel the discomfort of being a stranger in this world. Her heart was still bound to the court of Burgundy, to the soft laughter of the women she had once known, to the warmth of the fires that had crackled in her childhood home. But that world was gone. And now, she was here, in the midst of warriors who spoke a language she was only just beginning to understand. The days that followed the marriage felt like a blur. Kriemhild was expected to learn the ways of Etzel's court, to familiarize herself with the rough, unrefined customs of the Huns. The daily feasts were raucous affairs, with laughter and singing spilling into the night, as men toasted each other with their tankards, their voices booming through the hall. There was no place here for the polite, elegant dinner parties she had known in Burgundy, where every bite was eaten delicately, and every glass of wine was sipped with grace. Instead, in Etzel's court, wine flowed like rivers, and food was devoured with a hunger that matched the strength of the men who ate it. Kriemhild tried to find her place among the warriors. She held herself high, wearing her new role as Etzel's queen with the same proud posture that she had worn her title in Burgundy. But no matter how fiercely she held her head up, she couldn't help but feel the sting of difference. The people here did not view her as a widow or a queen. To them, she was just another piece in the grand scheme of power and conquest, a woman who had come to Etzel's side to strengthen his reign, and to help them in their never-ending thirst for battle. Yet, in all the chaos and confusion of this new life, something deep within Kriemhild remained unbroken. The life of revenge she had planned was not something that would be thwarted by culture, by tradition, or by the ways of Etzel's kingdom. She had already come too far, crossed too many lines, and spilled too much blood to stop now. In Etzel's court, she might have been a stranger, but she would make sure that she was never forgotten. She had witnessed too much of the brutality in the eyes of those around her to back down. Etzel's kingdom might have been forged in the flames of war, but Kriemhild had learned to wield her own fire. It burned for revenge. It burned for the justice that she had longed for. And no matter how alien this world felt, no matter how foreign the court might be, she was no longer the woman who had lost everything. She was a queen with a purpose. A woman of vengeance. And in this strange, unfamiliar kingdom, she would rise. The letter lay in Kriemhild's hand, its paper creased from hours of grip, but its meaning was as clear as the fiery resolve burning in her chest. Her fingers trembled, but not from fear. She had not been afraid in a long time. This letter was her message to the world. A summons, a beckoning for her brothers and Hagen, the men who had betrayed the one she loved, the men who had torn her life apart. They would come, thinking they were entering a hall of peace, a place where reconciliation would be offered and old wounds healed. How sweet it would be to watch them walk right into her trap, unaware of the storm that awaited them. Kriemhild's heart had changed since that fateful day, the day her husband's blood had stained the earth and left her with nothing but grief and a thirst for vengeance. The Kriemhild who had once known love, who had once known softness, had been buried under the weight of her sorrow, replaced by a woman whose heart burned with a fury that could not be extinguished. She had waited for years, her anger simmering beneath the surface, but now it was time. The pieces of her plan had fallen into place, and this was the final stroke, the invitation. She would call them all to Etzel's feast, those who had wronged her, those who had turned their backs on her, those who had stolen the joy from her life. The invitation would be their last mistake. She had spoken to Etzel, who, though he was a man of power, had not questioned her motives. He had seen the flames in her eyes, and though his kingdom was one of war, one of endless conquest, he understood her desire for retribution. She had married him, yes, but it was not for love, never for love. She had made that clear from the start. It was for something far deeper, far darker. Etzel had granted her this feast, the chance to pull the strings of fate one last time. The brothers would come, thinking they could lay the past to rest. How naive they were. How utterly blind. The day of the feast arrived, and Etzel's halls filled with the clamor of warriors, the sound of boots hitting stone, the laughter of men who had long been hardened by battle. But amid this noise, Kriemhild stood still, her gaze fixed on the far-off horizon. She was not the same woman who had walked into Etzel's court. She had transformed, her grief had turned to resolve, her sorrow into a fire that could not be quenched. She was a queen not of grace, but of power, a woman who had learned that the only way to survive in a world of broken promises was to make the world itself tremble. Her brothers and Hagen would come with the best of intentions, thinking they had been invited to a feast of peace. They would sit at her table, unaware that they were walking straight into her hands. They would be seated, honored, and they would think that the years of hatred could be forgotten, that the blood that had been spilled could be forgiven. But in the depths of Kriemhild's heart, the only thing she could offer them was the reckoning they so richly deserved. Kriemhild watched the procession of guests, her eyes sharp, scanning the figures that entered Etzel's hall. She knew that soon, the moment of truth would arrive. Her brothers, Gunther and Gernot, would enter with their faces full of hope, full of expectations that Kriemhild had long since abandoned. They were naive, so desperately hopeful, so willing to believe that peace was within their reach. Hagen, the one who had been the most responsible for Siegfried's death, would be with them. The man who had spilled her husband's blood without a second thought, who had stolen away the joy she once knew, would sit at her table and not even know that the table was set for him. As they entered the hall, the warmth of the fire was nothing compared to the icy chill that gripped Kriemhild's heart. She forced herself to look at them with the same calm that she had practiced for so many years. They had no idea what she was capable of now, how far she was willing to go to make them pay. The woman who had once cried for Siegfried, the woman who had once begged for peace, was gone. In her place was a queen, one who would see her vengeance done, no matter the cost. Gunther stepped forward, his face filled with a strange mixture of hope and apprehension. He had thought that time had healed all wounds, that distance had soothed the bitterness. But Kriemhild knew better. There was no healing for this, no forgiveness for what had been done. And there was no longer any reason to pretend. She had lived with her grief long enough. Now, she would live with her revenge. "Welcome, my brothers," Kriemhild's voice rang through the hall, soft yet carrying the weight of centuries. Her gaze flickered to Hagen, whose eyes shone with false humility, and then to Gunther, whose expression was filled with a desperate hope that only made her hatred burn brighter. "Come, sit," Kriemhild continued, her voice smooth like silk but cold as ice. She gestured to the table, the lavish spread of food, the wine that flowed freely. They took their seats, unaware that the feast they had come to share would be their last, the final reckoning in the long saga of betrayal and death. Kriemhild's hand clenched in her lap, the letter from years ago still folded neatly in her palm. The piece of parchment that had invited her brothers and Hagen to this moment, to the final meeting of fates. The letter had been a promise to herself that no matter how many years had passed, no matter how much pain she had to endure, this moment would come. The fateful moment when they would all sit down together and face the consequences of their actions. The feast began, the food heavy and rich, the wine dark and deep. But Kriemhild barely noticed. Her mind was far away, her heart pulsing with the rhythm of vengeance. She watched as her brothers and Hagen ate, their laughter ringing in the hall, unaware of the storm that was rising around them. They had thought they were safe, that they could put the past behind them. But Kriemhild's plan was in motion, and there was no going back. She would make them pay for Siegfried. She would make them pay for everything. As the night wore on, the hall grew louder with the sounds of drunken revelry. But Kriemhild's thoughts were focused solely on the men who had once been her family, who had once sworn to protect her. She had invited them to her table. She had promised them peace. But what she offered them instead was a reckoning they would never forget. The final act of her vengeance was now in motion, and nothing could stop it. Etzel's kingdom was nothing like Burgundy. The moment one crossed its borders, the air itself seemed to hum with a different kind of power. The land stretched vast and wild, dark forests and treacherous mountains looming like silent guardians, watching over Etzel's people. The people here did not fear nature, they reveled in it, embraced it. The clang of weapons could always be heard in the distance, and even the children played with wooden swords, their voices sharp with the thrill of battle. It was a kingdom where every warrior was forged in fire, where strength was not just admired, but expected. And above it all, there was Etzel himself, the mighty ruler, surrounded by his fierce followers. But for those who came from the peaceful courts of Burgundy, the scene was like stepping into a world so foreign it almost seemed unreal. Burgundy, with its ornate halls, its delicate silks and shimmering gold, was a land of soft words, of diplomacy, and carefully crafted peace. In Etzel's court, there was no softness. The halls were decorated not with tapestries, but with the trophies of battle, the heads of defeated enemies, their eyes still seeming to watch from the walls, judging anyone who dared to enter. The air was thick with the scent of blood and sweat, a constant reminder of the world that these people had built through force, through fear. Every gesture here was one of power. Every word carried weight. Kriemhild, having spent years in Burgundy, where her family had lived lives of nobility and grace, stood in Etzel's court and felt the difference in her bones. She could not deny the shock in her heart when she first saw it. The way the floor was so often slick with the remnants of battles fought in the very halls, the way laughter echoed through the stone, filled with a rawness that would have been unthinkable in the courts she had known. She had once been surrounded by the soft sounds of music, of quiet conversations over fine wine. Here, the songs were of victory, of warriors, of battles that rang out like thunder across the land. There was no gentle conversation between men and women here. Only commands, only authority. But in the midst of it all, Kriemhild had made her choice. She had chosen Etzel, not because of love, but because of power, because she knew that in this world, love would not save her. Here, in Etzel's court, no one was weak. No one showed emotion unless they could back it with strength. And as she looked around, she couldn't help but wonder if, somewhere deep within her, this was what she had always wanted. To belong to a world where vengeance could be carried out without hesitation, where every action was met with either respect or fear. She had once been a woman who cried for the loss of her husband, a woman who had worn her heart on her sleeve, but here, there was no room for tears. Her brothers, too, would feel the weight of this difference. They had arrived with their hopes for peace, their hearts still tied to the world they left behind in Burgundy. They had walked into this world unprepared for what awaited them, their delicate Burgundy sensibilities no match for the raw force that Etzel's court demanded. Gunther, who had once held power through charm and alliances, now found himself surrounded by men who measured their worth by their strength, their might in battle, not in words. And Hagen, the ever-proud warrior, might have thought he understood this world, but even he couldn't shake the cold shiver that ran down his spine as he gazed at the brutal grandeur of Etzel's court. This was a land where mercy did not exist. It was the clash of worlds, the delicate dance of words from Burgundy meeting the savage nature of Etzel's kingdom. Burgundy's silks clashed with the leather of the Huns. Where Burgundy's warriors fought with tactics, the men of Etzel's court lived and died by sheer will. It was a kingdom where the strong thrived, and the weak were discarded, a stark contrast to the softer world of diplomacy and family ties that the Burgundians were accustomed to. Kriemhild moved through it all with grace, but even she could not escape the primal pull of this new world. As she walked among the warriors, her thoughts turned cold, her heart hardening with the years of grief and revenge that had shaped her into the woman she had become. She looked at her brothers, standing out of place in their fine clothing, their eyes unsure as they tried to make sense of the world around them. They had no understanding of this place, of the raw power that held it together. They had come, believing that the banquet Kriemhild had prepared for them was one of peace, that there was still hope to mend what had been broken. But all Kriemhild could see now was the path that had led her here, a path that had begun with the death of Siegfried and had brought her to the throne of a king who cared little for words and much for the weight of his sword. Etzel's men watched them with silent eyes, their gazes harsh and unflinching. There was no warmth in these warriors, no love. They were not men of courtly manners, they were men of war. And Kriemhild realized with a shiver that they saw through her brothers and their soft, uncertain faces. They saw them as weak, weak like the Burgundy they had left behind. As the feast began, the difference between the two cultures became even more apparent. The music that echoed in Burgundy's courts, light and elegant, was replaced by deep, drumming rhythms that shook the very walls of Etzel's hall. The food was rich, heavy, meant to fuel warriors, not dainty guests. The laughter was louder here, more guttural, like the growl of a beast, and it only grew more intense as the night wore on. The Huns ate and drank with abandon, their voices rising in a song of triumph, while the Burgundians sat stiffly, caught between politeness and discomfort, their eyes darting about as they tried to navigate the tension that grew with each passing moment. Kriemhild watched them, her heart turning as cold as the stone walls around them. She had made her choice, but even now, she could not escape the pull of the world she had left behind, the soft warmth of Burgundy, the tenderness of a life once filled with love. Yet here, amid the clamor of Etzel's court, she knew that there was no going back. She had burned that bridge the day Siegfried died. And so, she watched as the two worlds collided, her brothers unaware, their pride and hope their only armor. The kingdom of Burgundy, with its gentle ways, its courts of comfort, had no place in Etzel's world. There was no room for softness here, only strength, only survival. The contrast was impossible to ignore, and Kriemhild could not help but wonder if the weight of it all would eventually break them. The air in the hall was thick with tension. It seemed that time itself had slowed, the flickering of torches on the walls casting long, trembling shadows that seemed to stretch out over the entire room. The clinking of goblets and the murmur of low conversation did little to break the coldness that had settled like a heavy fog, weighing down on the gathering. Kriemhild sat at the head of the table, her face as composed as a statue, but beneath the surface, something dark and terrible was stirring. Tonight, this feast would be remembered for its quiet violence. There were no sword fights, no blood spilled on the stone floors, yet this night was a battle like none other. Kriemhild's eyes, cold as the northern winds, were fixed on the one man who had betrayed her, the man who had taken away everything she had loved, Hagen. He sat across from her, his broad shoulders slightly hunched, his gaze flickering nervously around the room, as if sensing the storm gathering in the woman before him. The feast had begun as any other, with food laid out in abundance, the aroma of roasted meats and sweet fruits filling the hall. The laughter had been loud and careless, the banter between Kriemhild's brothers and Etzel's warriors strained but polite. Yet, for Kriemhild, there was no joy in the night. The past few years had worn down her heart, turning it from the fragile thing it once was into something hard, something filled with a burning rage that could no longer be contained. She had planned this night for too long to let it slip away. Her eyes narrowed as she studied Hagen, watching him carefully, calculating the exact moment to strike. The man who had killed Siegfried, her Siegfried, was here, sitting just a few feet away, pretending to be a guest, pretending to be at peace. And she, who had spent so many years mourning, waiting for this exact moment, now felt an overwhelming flood of emotions. It was not just grief she felt now, it was fury, a kind of fury that threatened to consume her whole. A silence had fallen over the table, almost as if everyone had become aware that something was about to happen, something that would change the course of everything. Kriemhild stood, her movements sharp, precise, and the clinking of her heels against the stone floor echoed through the room like a drumbeat. She was beautiful, yes, but there was nothing soft about her now. She was not the mourning widow from years before. She was the woman who had become something else entirely, someone born of pain and vengeance, and tonight, the cost of that transformation would be paid. Hagen, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The name left her lips so smoothly, so calmly, that it sent a shiver through the room. She had practiced saying it, over and over, in her mind, but now that she said it aloud, it felt as though it could have been the whisper of a ghost or the final judgment of a judge. Do you know what I'm speaking of? The murder of Siegfried? A ripple of shock ran through the room, but no one dared to move. Hagen's eyes, which had been flicking nervously earlier, now locked with hers, and in that moment, everything seemed to freeze. He knew what was coming. He could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating, like the promise of a storm. He swallowed hard, his hands clenching around the goblet before him, but his voice remained calm, too calm, as though he were trying to hold on to some semblance of control. I know nothing of what you speak, my lady, Hagen said, his tone smooth, almost too smooth, as if he were trying to bury the truth beneath layers of politeness. His eyes didn't waver from hers, but his pulse was quickening. The guilt, the weight of the crime, was buried deep within him, but he could feel the pressure building, squeezing the life out of his chest. Kriemhild's lips curled into a thin smile, a smile that carried no warmth, only coldness, like the steel of a blade. Lies, she said softly. You think I do not know the truth? You think I do not know how my husband died? How you planned it, how you murdered him in cold blood, with no mercy, no hesitation. Her words pierced the air like a thunderclap, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. The faces of the men around the table were a mixture of confusion and fear, and for just a second, Kriemhild saw the flicker of panic in Hagen's eyes. But he quickly masked it, his gaze turning steely as he tried to control the situation. The tension in the room was unbearable, like a bowstring stretched to its breaking point. Hagen, Kriemhild continued, her voice now hard as stone, you think you have escaped, that you have buried the truth in the past. But I have not forgotten. And neither has Siegfried. His death is still with me, still in my heart, still in my mind. It will never be erased. And neither will you. The room seemed to shrink around them as Kriemhild took a step closer to Hagen. Her presence was overwhelming now, like the force of a tidal wave, and Hagen could feel the weight of her gaze pressing down on him, suffocating him. The wall seemed to close in on him, and all the false bravado he had built up over the years crumbled beneath the weight of her words. Kriemhild reached out, slowly, deliberately, and with a swift motion, she grabbed the edge of Hagen's goblet, slamming it down onto the table with a force that made everyone jump. The sound echoed through the hall, and for a brief, breathless moment, the world seemed to stop. "You thought you could take everything from me, Hagen," she whispered, her voice low, barely above a breath. "But you cannot take my vengeance. Not now, not ever." The room was still, all eyes on Kriemhild and Hagen. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Would Hagen deny it further? Would he try to fight her, to lie his way out? Or would he, for the first time, face the consequences of his treachery? Kriemhild stood over him, her eyes blazing with the fury of a woman scorned, a woman who had lost everything she loved and had nothing left to give but revenge. The air between them was electric with anger, with grief, with years of pain that had built up in the silence of their unspoken truth. But Hagen was silent, his jaw tight, his chest heaving. There was nowhere to run now. The truth was out, and there would be no hiding from it. The feast had turned into something much darker. What was meant to be a celebration, a moment of gathering and peace, had become a battleground of words, of emotions, of betrayals laid bare for all to see. And Kriemhild was not done yet. This was only the beginning. The feast was her arena, and Hagen, the murderer, was now her prey. The tension in the hall was suffocating. The air hung heavy, thick with the stench of blood and betrayal, and the sound of clinking goblets now seemed out of place, like an unwelcome guest at a gathering of ghosts. The feasting was long over, replaced by an uneasy quiet that crept through the shadows of the hall. The vast room was bathed in flickering torchlight, but it felt colder than it ever had before, colder than the stone walls surrounding them. Something terrible was about to unfold. Kriemhild stood by the high table, her eyes fixed on Hagen with a fire that burned hotter than any torch. Her heart, so long twisted by grief and vengeance, now felt as though it might burst from her chest. She could feel the weight of every moment leading up to this one pressing down on her like an iron vice. The years of waiting, of watching, of grieving, had come to this. The end. The final reckoning. But even as she moved toward her goal, the scales of fate were shifting again. Hagen, who had so long hidden his guilt behind a mask of strength and bravado, now faced the consequences of his actions. His hands, once so steady and strong, gripped the sword tightly as he watched Kriemhild's icy stare. It was too late for apologies, too late for redemption. The trap had been set, and they were all caught in its snare. And then it happened. Without warning, without hesitation, Hagen raised his sword. The sound of steel cutting through the air was deafening, like the crack of thunder on a stormy night. A cry rang out, a scream so pure in its horror that it seemed to echo across eternity. It was the cry of a child. Etzel's son, the young prince, had been standing near the table, his eyes wide with innocence and wonder, unaware of the storm that had been brewing all around him. He never stood a chance. Hagen's blade found its mark in an instant. The boy crumpled to the floor, blood spilling like a river from the wound, staining the stone beneath him. Time seemed to stand still, the world holding its breath as the reality of what had just occurred crashed over everyone in the room. The Huns froze, their eyes wide with shock, while the Burgundians stood in stunned silence, their faces pale and twisted with disbelief. Kriemhild's breath caught in her throat. It was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Chaos erupted like a violent storm. The air filled with the clash of steel on steel, the shouts of men locked in brutal combat, and the screams of those who had come to feast, now fighting for their lives. In an instant, the once grand hall had transformed into a battlefield, the warm glow of the torches now obscured by the frenzy of combat. Blood soaked the floor, and the scent of death clung to the air like a cruel reminder of what had just been unleashed. Kriemhild's heart pounded in her chest as the room dissolved into madness. She stood there, her eyes wide with disbelief, watching as the lives of the Huns and the Burgundians collided in a violent and unstoppable force. She had planned this moment for so long, but now that it was happening, she felt a strange emptiness inside her. She had wanted this revenge, this reckoning, but seeing the destruction unfold before her was not as sweet as she had imagined. The boy's death had triggered a vicious tide of violence that swept through the hall like a flood, drowning everything in its path. Etzel, furious beyond reason, let out a terrible roar, his voice a sound that carried the fury of 1,000 storms. His warriors rushed to avenge the death of his son, their eyes wild with grief and rage. The clash of swords rang out, and soon, the floor was awash with the blood of both Huns and Burgundians alike. No one was spared. Kriemhild's gaze never left Hagen. She saw the man, once so proud, now fighting for his life, but her eyes were void of sympathy. The death of the young prince had done what she had wanted. The walls of honor and loyalty had crumbled, and all that was left was war. She had set the stage, and now the dance of death had begun. Hagen's face, usually so calm and composed, was twisted in fury and fear as he fought for survival. His sword cut through the air, each strike a desperate attempt to fend off the oncoming tide of Huns. But Kriemhild knew, deep in her heart, that his fate was sealed. The curse of the Nibelung treasure had already claimed him. Now, the weight of his sins would come crashing down upon him, and there would be no escaping it. The fighting in the hall was savage, each blow more desperate than the last, as if every man present knew that the very ground beneath their feet had turned into a graveyard. The Huns were relentless, their fury unchecked by the sense of honor that the Burgundians once held dear. It was an all-out slaughter now, a massacre that left no room for mercy, no place for honor. It was the raw brutality of revenge, of betrayal, of lives torn asunder by the twisted hands of fate. Kriemhild moved through the chaos with cold precision. She watched as the men around her fought and died, but it was Hagen's life that mattered most. His actions had set this train of destruction in motion, and now it was time to see it through to the end. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, a mixture of grief and satisfaction that twisted inside her like a knife. She had lost everything, her husband, her family, her peace, and now she would make them all pay. Hagen, struggling to keep his footing as he fought back the Huns, turned his gaze to Kriemhild for just a moment. In that brief second, he saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. It was not pity or hatred, it was something far worse. It was the icy calm of a woman who had nothing left to lose. It was a look that sent a shiver down his spine, a look that told him she would not stop until he had paid for his sins. And so the massacre raged on, fueled by a vengeance that could not be quenched, until the once grand hall of Etzel's court became a tomb, filled with the dead and the dying. The blood of the fallen soaked into the earth, mixing with the tears of those who had lost everything. And in the midst of it all, Kriemhild stood tall, her heart a battlefield of its own, knowing that she had finally achieved the reckoning she had so long desired, but at what cost? The earth trembled beneath the weight of the chaos unfolding. The cries of the dying filled the air, mingling with the clash of steel and the thundering of hooves. In that moment, the once proud and noble Burgundian warriors stood at the precipice of their doom. Gunther, the once unshakable king, found himself caught in the web of betrayal he had woven so carelessly. The battle had begun with such fury, but now, it seemed to stretch on like a nightmare with no end. Every swing of a sword, every clash of armor, every desperate cry for help only added to the relentless weight of destruction that seemed to bear down on Gunther and his men. One by one, they fell. Their blood stained the earth they had once sworn to protect, and their bodies, broken and battered, became the silent witnesses to their own downfall. Gunther, standing tall amidst the battle, his face grim and unyielding, was no longer the proud king who had led his men to glory. He was a man gripped by fear and regret, a man who had realized too late the cost of his ambition and his own pride. Each strike he delivered, each step he took, was slower than the last, his strength waning with every moment. The weight of the lives lost, the weight of his decisions, was too much for him to carry. Around him, his men fought valiantly, but there was no victory to be found. Each of them was a shadow of their former selves, each of them carrying the heavy burden of the sins they had committed. They had betrayed their friend, their brother, and now they were paying the ultimate price. The clash of swords echoed like the death knell for a kingdom that had once been great. Every swing of the blade brought them closer to the edge, closer to the oblivion they had earned. Their once proud shields were shattered, their armor dented and broken, each battle cry now a desperate plea for salvation that would never come. Gunther's heart sank as he saw his men fall one by one, their faces etched with fear and pain. In the midst of the carnage, his thoughts drifted to the past. He remembered the days when they had all laughed together, when they had stood united, bound by friendship and loyalty. Now, those days felt like a distant memory, a fading dream that had slipped through his fingers like sand. There was no escaping the reality of the present, no way to undo the damage they had caused. And then it came. Hagen, the man who had once been his trusted companion, the man who had pledged to protect the honor of the kingdom, now stood before him, his eyes cold and calculating. Gunther had once called him a brother, but now, as Hagen raised his sword, he knew that this was the final blow, the one that would end it all. Hagen's eyes held no remorse, no sorrow. There was only the icy resolve of a man who had done what he believed must be done, no matter the cost. Gunther's breath caught in his throat, his body frozen in place, unable to move, unable to escape. The weight of his own failures had caught up with him, and in this moment, there was no way out. Hagen's sword swung with deadly precision, and Gunther's world went black. The pain was sudden, sharp, and overwhelming, but it was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Gunther's body crumpled to the ground, his once mighty form now reduced to nothing more than a lifeless heap of flesh and bone. As the final blow was struck, the battle seemed to slow down, as though the world itself was taking a moment to mourn the fall of a kingdom, the fall of a legacy. The cries of the Huns, the roars of victory, seemed to fade into the distance as the gravity of the moment settled over the battlefield like a heavy fog. One by one, the remaining Burgundian warriors were taken down. Their faces, once filled with pride and strength, now twisted in pain, in fear, and regret. The battlefield had become a testament to the cost of betrayal, to the price of blood spilled for selfish ambition. No one was spared. No one would leave this place alive. The sky, which had once been bright and clear, now seemed to reflect the darkness that had consumed the land. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a red-orange glow over the battlefield, as though the heavens themselves wept for the bloodshed that had unfolded below. The wind carried the scent of death, mingling with the faint sounds of clashing metal and the occasional cry of pain. But amidst the carnage, there was no one left to mourn the fallen Burgundians. There was no one left to remember their sacrifices, their victories, their honor. The Huns, fierce and merciless, had claimed their victory. The kingdom of Burgundy was no more, its once proud warriors scattered and broken, their legacy reduced to nothing more than a forgotten tale of betrayal and ruin. Kriemhild, standing at the edge of the battlefield, watched the carnage unfold before her. The satisfaction she had sought for so long was finally hers, but it tasted bitter in her mouth. Her heart, once full of grief, now held only emptiness. Revenge had claimed everything, her family, her kingdom, and even her own soul. There was nothing left. Nothing but a field of death, where once there had been life, and laughter, and hope. And so, the Burgundians fell, one by one, their names whispered on the winds of history, their story a cautionary tale of pride, of betrayal, of the price of vengeance. The kingdom of Burgundy was no more, its people scattered like ashes on the wind. And as the last of them fell, the world seemed to hold its breath, as if even the earth itself was mourning the loss of what had once been. The air was thick with anticipation, a tension so palpable it seemed to make every breath feel heavier, like an omen of the storm that was about to break. Kriemhild stood at the center of it all, her eyes locked on Hagen, the man who had torn her world apart. His defiance was still there, the coldness in his gaze that had once been her brother's shield, now the mask of a murderer. Her heart burned, the weight of grief twisted into something far darker, more consuming. The years of loss, the pain of watching her beloved Siegfried fall, the sight of her family disintegrating. It had all been building to this. The moment of reckoning. And she was the one to deliver it. Kriemhild's voice cut through the air, sharp and unforgiving, her words a knife that had been sharpened over years of torment. She had waited for this moment when she could make the man who had broken her, who had killed the love of her life, pay. Hagen, the one who had betrayed them all, who had plunged the knife into Siegfried's back, was now standing before her, a defiant grin playing at the corner of his lips, as if he had no fear, as if there would be no consequences. But there would be. There had to be. The clang of the sword being drawn from its sheath was like a bell tolling, signaling the inevitable end. Kriemhild didn't hesitate. She wasn't a woman who would wait any longer for justice. She was the one who would bring it. With a strength born from sorrow, from the burning fury of all that had been taken from her, Kriemhild lunged forward. Her grip on the blade was steady, her mind only focused on the man who had once been her family, the one who had destroyed everything. Hagen's face twisted into a grimace as he raised his own sword to block, but he was slow, so slow. Years of deception had dulled his senses, and now, it was too late. The cold edge of Kriemhild's blade sliced through the air with a ferocity that mirrored her rage, striking with the precision of a woman who had nothing left to lose. The force of the blow sent a shudder through Hagen's frame. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. The sound of steel meeting flesh rang out in the air, and Hagen's blood poured out, staining the ground beneath them, a life extinguished in an instant. He had betrayed her. He had taken everything from her. And now, she had taken his life. Kriemhild watched as Hagen crumpled to the ground, his lifeless eyes staring up at her with that same defiance, as if even in death, he refused to acknowledge the justice that had come for him. She stood over him, her chest heaving with the weight of what she had just done. Her revenge was complete, but somehow, the victory felt hollow. The satisfaction she had once imagined didn't fill her, it left an emptiness, a void. She had killed him, but Siegfried was still gone. Nothing would bring him back. But there was still one more thing left to do. One last piece of the puzzle that had to be set right. The treasure. The Nibelung gold. It had been the reason for everything, the cause of the war, the bloodshed, the betrayal, the ruin. It had been taken from her, from Siegfried, from their love, and now it would be returned. Kriemhild turned, her steps slow, deliberate, as she made her way toward the treasure. The treasure that had been the root of all this pain. Her heart pounded, not from the exertion of the fight, but from the weight of the moment. She could feel the treasure, almost as if it called to her, urging her to take what was rightfully hers. The sight of it, shining with the same golden light it always had, only now it seemed to mock her. She had waited too long, suffered too much, to let it slip away again. This treasure, this cursed treasure, was all that was left of the world she once knew, the world that had been ripped apart by lies, by betrayal, by greed. She reached for the gold, her fingers brushing against it, and for a brief moment, it was as if the weight of all her pain was lifted. But that relief was fleeting. What she held in her hand was not a symbol of victory. It was a symbol of loss. A reminder of everything she had lost along the way. As her fingers wrapped around the gold, the memories flooded back. Siegfried's laughter, his warmth, his love, it all seemed so far away now, as if it belonged to another life. She had killed Hagen, taken the treasure, but it didn't bring him back. Nothing would. She was left with only the hollow ache of revenge, the taste of victory that soured on her tongue. The treasure was hers now. She had reclaimed it. But it had come at such a cost. The price of vengeance was steep, and Kriemhild had paid it all. There was nothing left now but the cold silence of the aftermath, the weight of a battle fought and won, but at what price? What had it all been for? The room was still, the treasure glittering in her hand, yet she could not feel its value. The riches were nothing. The gold meant nothing. It had all been about revenge, and now that she had it, she realized that the victory she had longed for was never going to fill the void. The void that only Siegfried's presence could have filled. And as she stood there, holding the treasure in her hand, the silence of her grief echoed around her, and for a brief moment, she wondered if it had all been worth it. Kriemhild stood in the heart of the chaos, her chest heaving as the weight of everything she had fought for, the gold, the revenge, the bloodshed, finally crushed her beneath its burden. The world around her had become a blur of noise and motion. Her hands, once steady and sure, now trembled with the realization that everything was slipping away, just as it had always been destined to do. The room felt suffocating, the tension in the air palpable, as the Huns closed in around her. She had reached the end of her path, a path she had carved with the sharp edges of grief, rage, and loss. And now, she was face to face with the bitter truth: there was nothing left. A cold smile crossed her lips as she thought of her brothers, Gunther, Gernot, and the others, who had fallen, one by one. They had been her family, her blood, and now they were gone, victims of the very treachery that she had sought to undo. She had avenged Siegfried's death, but at what cost? The faces of the men she had loved, the faces of those who had once been her kin, were now only memories, washed away by the flood of vengeance. The clashing of weapons, the screams of men, the cries of dying soldiers, it all seemed so distant now. She had achieved what she had set out to do, but the triumph felt hollow. The treasure was hers. Hagen was dead. Yet, as she stood there, she wondered if it had all been worth it. What had she gained? Was this truly the end she had envisioned? A sharp pain snapped her out of her thoughts. Her hand went instinctively to her side, where blood began to stain her once gleaming dress. It was warm, flowing like a river. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor. A pool of crimson bloomed beneath her, staining the ground like a final, tragic signature. Kriemhild's eyes fluttered, and her vision narrowed to a single point, a figure standing above her, cold and impassive. It was not a stranger, not an enemy she had never seen before. No, it was someone who had once been close to her, someone who had shared her blood. Gunther. Her brother, the one she had once looked up to, the one who had stood by her when their father had been alive, the one who had promised to protect her. And yet, here he was, standing above her, his expression unreadable, as though this moment, this act, was simply a matter of course. The betrayal was all too much. How had it come to this? How had she gone from being a sister, a daughter, a beloved queen, to this broken woman lying in her own blood? What had happened to the world she had once known, the world of love and family and promise? Kriemhild's breathing grew shallow, each breath a struggle against the weight of her own body, her own pain. Her fingers twitched, her arms trembling with the effort to rise, but it was no use. She was beyond saving. And then, in the final stillness of it all, she realized something. She wasn't afraid. In those last moments, there was no fear. No anger. There was only an aching, unbearable sadness. Sadness for the woman she had become. Sadness for the family she had lost. Sadness for Siegfried, who had never stood a chance. The world around her faded, the sounds of the battle distant, as if she were falling away from it all. Her last thoughts were of him, the man she had loved with everything she had. Siegfried, whose death had set this entire tragedy in motion. If only she had known that seeking vengeance would tear apart everything she had ever known. If only she had known that this path would lead her to her own end. Kriemhild's fingers went limp, and the treasure she had fought so hard for slipped from her grasp. It lay there in the silence, glistening but hollow, as if mocking her. Her journey was over. The Nibelung saga, the tale of love and betrayal, of revenge and death, had reached its final chapter. Gunther's face was the last thing she saw before the darkness took her. His features, etched in stone, showed no remorse, no recognition of the woman she had once been, the sister he had once known. And in the end, all Kriemhild had was the haunting thought that maybe, just maybe, she had become the very thing she had sought to destroy. A creature of vengeance, of pain, of endless sorrow. And it was not a comfort. It was not the freedom she had thought it would be. The world around her became silent as the last breath left her body, her life fading away like the final flicker of a dying flame. In that moment, Kriemhild knew that the price had been too high, and it was too late to turn back. The saga of the Nibelungs had come to a tragic, inevitable end. The once grand halls of Burgundy, filled with laughter, music, and the warm echoes of royal commands, now stood eerily silent. The golden banners that once fluttered proudly in the breeze, symbols of power and prosperity, hung lifeless, as if mourning their own fate. The echoes of past glory were now drowned out by the sounds of grief and loss. The court of Burgundy, once a center of strength and might, was now nothing more than a crumbling shadow of its former self. Gunther's throne, once a symbol of unquestioned authority, now seemed cold, abandoned, as if it too had surrendered to the inevitable fall. The great hall, where countless feasts had been held in the days of prosperity, now felt hollow. No one came to sit at the long, polished tables, no servants hurried to fill goblets with wine. Silence had become the kingdom's only constant companion. The men who had once rallied behind their king now lay scattered across the fields, their lives extinguished in a single, chaotic storm of bloodshed. The court, once filled with the proud and the noble, was now filled with whispers of betrayal, of a kingdom betrayed not just by outside forces but by the very hands that had once promised to protect it. The warriors who had fought with valor, who had shared victories and defeats side by side, now found themselves victims of their own actions. The familiar faces of Gunther, Gernot, and their brothers were gone. The kingdom had lost not just its leaders but its very soul. The people of Burgundy, once proud and unshaken in their faith, now found themselves broken, scattered like the remnants of a shattered dream. How could they rebuild what had been so violently torn apart? How could they continue to serve a king who no longer lived, a queen who had fallen from grace, and a land that had been marked by such irreversible destruction? Kriemhild's vengeance, which had seemed so justified in the heat of her grief, had cast a shadow that now stretched across Burgundy like a permanent eclipse. The land that had once flourished beneath the rule of the Burgundian court now lay barren, hollowed out by the choices made in the name of revenge. And as the final pieces of the kingdom crumbled, the heavy question lingered: was it all worth it? The eyes of the survivors, if there were any, held only empty stares, as though the light of life had been extinguished from their hearts. The houses that once rang with joy and celebration now stood as quiet ruins, filled with memories of what had been lost. The children of Burgundy, those innocent souls who had never known the ways of war, would grow up in a world forever scarred by the darkness their ancestors had unleashed. The kingdom's future, like the remnants of a dream that had been violently shattered, seemed hopelessly out of reach. Each day, as the sun rose over the remains of the once proud kingdom, the people walked in a daze, unsure of how to face the future. How could they carry on knowing the cost of their past? The roads that had once been filled with travelers, merchants, and foreign dignitaries were now empty, abandoned, as though the world itself had turned its back on Burgundy. The wealth that had once flowed freely, brought by ships and traders, was gone, stolen by the greedy hands of those who had played their parts in the destruction of the kingdom. And yet, amid the despair, there was a deep sense of loss that went beyond the material. The kingdom had lost its heart. The ties that had once bound people together, family, loyalty, honor, had been severed, leaving a cold emptiness behind. It was not just the men who had died, but the very spirit of Burgundy itself that had been buried beneath the weight of betrayal and bloodshed. The light of the kingdom's greatness had been snuffed out, replaced by the dark shadow of what had been. There were those who still whispered in the dark corners of the land, mourning what had been, but those whispers only seemed to make the silence that much louder. The legacy of the Nibelung treasure, once a symbol of hope and power, had instead become a symbol of corruption, of how a single item, a single act, could turn everything to dust. The treasure, once so bright with promise, now lay forgotten, its magic and its lure having destroyed everything in its wake. Even the great halls of the court, where the kings and queens had once stood, now felt like ghosts of the past. The grand tapestries, once vibrant with tales of victories and triumphs, now hung like tattered memories. The chambers that had been filled with the laughter of children, the warmth of family gatherings, now echoed with the hollow sounds of what might have been. There was no joy, no pride. Only emptiness. Only the cold touch of regret. As the days passed, the remnants of the Burgundian kingdom seemed to fade into the shadows of history. It was a place that had once been full of life, full of promise, full of the potential for greatness. But now, all that remained were the broken pieces of a shattered world. The sun that rose each morning seemed a little dimmer, as if it too had grown tired of casting its light on a land so full of sorrow. The rise and fall of Burgundy had been a tale of great ambition and deep tragedy. What was once a kingdom of warriors and rulers now stood as a testament to the cost of vengeance, the price of power, and the fragility of life. Those who had once called it home would now tell stories of a time long gone, of a kingdom that had reached too high and fallen too far. And somewhere, hidden in the remnants of the past, the faintest whisper of hope remained. A hope that, one day, the people of Burgundy might find the strength to rebuild, not just the kingdom, but the heart that had once made it whole. But for now, the land was silent, its wounds too fresh, its people too broken to dream of anything beyond the weight of the past. The Rhine River flowed relentlessly, its waters dark and cold, winding through the landscape like a silent observer of centuries-old tragedies. It had seen countless battles, witnessed the rise and fall of kings, and carried the weight of secrets no one dared to speak aloud. But today, it was carrying something else, a final, whispered promise that the treasure, with all its dark power, would never find peace. It had been cast into its depths once again, sinking deeper into the waters that had claimed so much already. The cursed treasure, once a symbol of great power and unimaginable wealth, was now lost, swallowed by the river's cold embrace, as if nature itself was rejecting its presence, as though the very earth was weary of its temptation and bloodshed. The treasure, long desired by kings and warriors, could never be claimed without cost, without suffering. A shudder passed over the water as though it too mourned the loss. And yet, the curse lingered. It wasn't over. The treasure was gone, but the sorrow it left behind was not. It clung to the land like a thick fog, making it impossible for any light to break through. The people who had sought it, fought for it, and destroyed everything in its wake, were gone. But their echoes, their mistakes, still whispered across the riverbanks, leaving a stain that would never wash away. Kriemhild had believed that by reclaiming the treasure, by holding it in her hands, she would finally bring an end to the agony of loss. She had thought that revenge would grant her peace. But in the end, she was left with nothing but the hollow weight of what she had lost and the terrible realization that the treasure itself had always been the true master. It had led her down a path of sorrow, and now, as she lay buried in the wreckage of her choices, the treasure had once again vanished, slipping away into the cold and different depths of the Rhine. And there it would remain. The river's surface shimmered under the pale moonlight, reflecting the quiet anguish that lay beneath. No one could see the treasure now. No one could touch it. It was gone, but its influence would never fade. The treasure had been buried beneath the waters, but its curse remained, embedded in the very fabric of the land. How many more lives would it take? How many more souls would fall before its lure? The curse had not simply vanished with the treasure's disappearance. It would linger, haunting the lands, until another soul, desperate and broken, would again seek its riches, only to fall prey to the same cycle of greed, betrayal, and bloodshed. The treasure was gone, but its shadow stretched far and wide, like the eternal night, never truly letting go. The men who had sought it, fought for it, killed for it, they were dead now. Gunther, Hagen, Gernot, all those who had believed they could control the power of the Nibelung horde, had perished in its name. Their bones now rested beneath the earth, forgotten by time but never by the curse. And Kriemhild, who had once been so full of life, so full of love and dreams, was gone too. She had given everything to the treasure, lost everything for it, and in the end, had received nothing but death's cold embrace. Her vengeance had consumed her, just as the treasure had consumed all those who came near it. The Rhine, though silent, seemed to carry the weight of the past in its steady current. The treasure was lost, but it would never be forgotten. It had taken so much already, and yet it demanded more. It was a hunger that could never be filled, a thirst that could never be quenched. As the years passed, as the world moved on, the legend would grow. The curse would become more than just a story. It would become a warning, a myth to keep children awake at night, a reminder that some things were never meant to be touched. The water's surface rippled, and for a fleeting moment, something glittered beneath. Was it the treasure, finally emerging from its watery grave? Or was it just a trick of the light, a fleeting glimpse of something that could never be fully understood, never fully grasped? Perhaps it didn't matter anymore. The treasure had served its purpose. It had shaped the fates of men and women, kings and queens, and now, all that was left was the silence of all that had been lost. The Nibelung treasure was gone, but the curse remained. It would follow those who sought it into their graves, leaving behind nothing but broken hearts, shattered dreams, and a land forever scarred. The river carried it away, but it would never be free. And in the depths of the Rhine, beneath the cold, unfeeling waters, the treasure would rest, for now. But it would never be at peace. The curse had been reaffirmed, and with it, the tragic legacy of the Nibelung saga. The night was alive with the sound of a voice, carrying through the cool, crisp air. Around the campfires and in the halls of ancient castles, the bards spoke with passion, their words flowing like a river, weaving tales of glory and sorrow, triumph and tragedy. The people listened in silence, their hearts gripped by the power of the stories, as if they had been there themselves, witnessing every battle, every betrayal, every heartbreak. In every village, in every town, in every corner of the land, the tale of the Nibelungs began to spread. It was a story that could not be ignored, a story that demanded to be heard. The bards did not merely tell it, they sang it, made it a living thing. They gave it a voice, a soul, a breath. And with each telling, the story grew. The voices of the fallen heroes, the cries of those betrayed, the thunder of the battles, all echoed in their songs, filling the hearts of those who listened. It was a story that lived on through the songs of the bards, passed from one generation to the next. And in every retelling, it became more than just a story, it became a lesson, a warning, a symbol of what could happen when pride, greed, and revenge consumed the hearts of men. The Nibelung saga was no longer just a tale of a few noble warriors, it was a mirror to the human soul, reflecting the darkest parts of who we are and what we could become. The voices of the bards carried the weight of the past, of those who had fallen, and the echo of their struggles still reverberated in the songs. Each verse seemed to pull the listener deeper into the tragedy, until they could feel the pain of Kriemhild's loss, the fury of Siegfried's murder, the hopelessness of a curse that would never be lifted. The tale of the Nibelungs became a part of the land itself, a thread woven through the very fabric of the people. As the bards traveled from village to village, the story spread like wildfire, igniting the imaginations of those who heard it. It wasn't just a story to them, it was a warning. It reminded them that even the greatest heroes could fall, that no matter how powerful you were, no matter how mighty your kingdom, the darkness of vengeance and greed could destroy everything you loved. It was a tale that resonated in the hearts of those who had known loss, those who had seen the pain of betrayal, those who understood the weight of revenge. In the grand halls of kings and queens, the Nibelung saga was told with reverence. It was more than just entertainment, it was a part of their history, a reflection of their own struggles and triumphs. The bards sang of noble warriors, of great battles fought for honor, but they also sang of the price that was paid for those battles. They sang of the cost of revenge, the toll it took on the soul, and the destruction that followed. And as the story spread, it became clear, this was no ordinary tale. This was the story of the human condition, of the complexities of love, loyalty, and betrayal. The bards carried the story through the lands, ensuring that it would never be forgotten. They sang not just to entertain, but to preserve the memory of those who had gone before. The tale of the Nibelungs would live on, passed down through generations, carried by the voices of those who refused to let it fade. It was as if the very fabric of the world had been touched by the story, and no matter how much time passed, it could never be erased. As the tale reached the furthest corners of the land, it became more than just a song. It became a part of the people's very souls. The listeners no longer heard just the words, they felt them. They understood the pain, the grief, the hunger for revenge that had destroyed so many lives. And in that moment, they saw something in themselves, something dark, something dangerous, something they had never truly understood before. The bards' voices wove through the air, carrying the tale of the Nibelungs to new places, new people, new lands. Every time they sang, the story grew, evolving and changing with each new audience, each new retelling. The names of Siegfried, Kriemhild, and Hagen became known to all, their fates sealed in the songs of the bards. The treasure, the curse, the bloodshed, they all became part of the myth, part of the legacy that would never be forgotten. In every verse, there was a haunting reminder: the Nibelung treasure was not just a physical object, but a symbol of the greed, the ambition, and the vengeance that could consume even the most noble hearts. The curse, though buried beneath the waves of the Rhine, lived on in the stories. It lived on in the hearts of those who heard it, whispering its warning to every listener: beware the darkness that lies within. The tale of the Nibelungs was not just a story to be told. It was a living thing, passed down through the ages, shaped by the hearts and minds of those who heard it. And as long as there were bards to sing it, as long as there were people to listen, the story would never die. It would live on, echoing through the generations, reminding all who heard it that the past was never truly gone, that it was always with us, shaping who we are and who we might become. The Nibelung saga had taken root, and it was spreading, one song at a time. In the flicker of firelight, long before ink met parchment, the story of the Nibelungs was not written but spoken, woven into the air like a spell. It existed not in the stillness of pages but in the rhythm of voices, the rise and fall of emotion that carried the listener into another world. Each telling was alive, shaped by the tongue that spoke it and the ears that heard it, as though the story itself breathed and changed with time. And in those shifting words, its true power lay, not in the fixed, but in the fluid. The saga was born in whispers, cries, and songs, passed from mouth to mouth like a secret too powerful to be contained. The tale was not merely recounted, it was relived, each teller imbuing it with their own truth, their own fears, their own hopes. A farmer by the Rhine might linger on the cursed treasure, turning it into a warning against greed, while a warrior would paint Siegfried's triumphs as a hymn to courage. In the hands of a mourning widow, Kriemhild's vengeance became not just a tale of wrath, but a lament for love lost. Every retelling became a reflection of the heart that carried it, a kaleidoscope of human longing and sorrow. In these oral traditions, the saga wasn't static, it was a river, flowing through generations, carving its way deeper into the soul of the people. The words changed as they traveled, but the emotions remained unyielding. Every sorrow bled into the next, every triumph became a fleeting gasp before the storm. The story morphed and twisted, adapting to the times, yet always keeping its essence: love, betrayal, vengeance, and the heavy weight of fate. When the saga spoke of Siegfried's death, the words were not just about a single man struck down by treachery. They were about the betrayal that every person fears, the loss that every heart dreads. It was a betrayal so profound it echoed through the centuries, reshaping itself to mirror the listener's own pain. And when Kriemhild rose from the ashes of her grief, her vengeance became more than an act of violence. It became a warning about what happens when a heart hardens, when love turns to fury, when the fire of revenge burns hotter than any other flame. The curse of the treasure was more than a plotline, it was a shadow that followed humanity itself. It wasn't just gold, it was desire, greed, ambition, the hunger for more that devours everything it touches. The treasure was cursed not by magic, but by the frailty of those who sought it. It became a symbol for the thing that tempts us, the thing we cannot let go of even as it destroys us. And in that curse, there was a truth that transcended the tale: the things we hold most dear are often the things that undo us. The symbolic threads of the saga were woven so tightly into the fabric of the tale that they seemed invisible, yet their weight was felt in every word. Hagen's cruelty, Gunther's weakness, Kriemhild's rage, they were not just characters, but embodiments of forces that linger in every human heart. Hagen's blade was not merely steel, it was the sharp edge of betrayal, the cut that never heals. Gunther's silence was not just cowardice, it was the fear of confronting the truth. And Kriemhild's vengeance, burning, relentless, was the fire that consumes even the purest of souls when anger is left unchecked. Yet, for all its tragedy, the story also carried a strange beauty. There was a poetic rhythm to its chaos, a terrible symmetry to its destruction. The saga didn't simply recount events, it held a mirror to the listener's own fears and desires. It whispered truths that were too raw to be spoken outright. In its curses, it reminded us of the cost of greed. In its love, it showed us what we are willing to lose. And in its vengeance, it revealed how easily justice can twist into ruin. As the saga spread through the lands, it began to grow roots in the minds of the people. The oral traditions gave it freedom to change, to adapt, to become what each listener needed it to be. It was not one story, but many. For some, it was a tale of heroes and villains, a drama of kings and queens. For others, it was a lesson about the dangers of ambition, the poison of revenge, the fragility of trust. And for a few, it was something deeper, an unspoken truth about the darkness that lurks within us all. Each telling was a mosaic, each piece fitting together to form a picture that was never truly complete. The storytellers themselves became part of the tale, shaping it, breathing life into it, keeping it alive. And as the word spread, they began to resonate beyond the borders of their origin. The Nibelung saga became a part of something greater, a shared memory, a collective heartbeat, a reminder of what it means to be human. The power of the saga lay not in its details, but in its essence. It wasn't about Siegfried's invincibility or Kriemhild's wrath or Hagen's betrayal, it was about the emotions that tied them together. It was about the choices that led them to their fates, the love that bound them and the hate that tore them apart. It was about the eternal struggle between what we want and what we are willing to sacrifice to get it. The words of the bards, shaped by countless voices over the centuries, carried the weight of these truths. And as the saga moved from the oral to the written, as it became etched into pages and preserved for the ages, it carried with it the echoes of those who had told it before. The words may have been inked, but they still breathed with the life of the fireside tales, still carried the weight of the voices that had come before. Even now, as the story lingers in the minds of those who hear it, its meanings continue to shift and grow. It is not a tale of the past, it is a tale of the present, of the future, of the eternal. It is the story of all who have loved, all who have lost, all who have burned with the fire of vengeance or the curse of desire. And though the tale may be old, its heartbeat remains, steady and unyielding, reminding us that some stories are never truly over. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the weight of unseen eyes. Above, the gods watched in their lofty silence, as mortal lives unraveled like fragile threads. They were there in every corner of the story, unseen but undeniably present, their hands shaping fate even as they remained distant. It was not love that bound them to humankind, nor hatred, it was something colder, something more unsettling. It was indifference. When Siegfried stood invincible, his skin hardened by dragon's blood, the gods had smiled faintly, but it was not an approval. To them, his triumph was a flicker of amusement in the eternal boredom of their existence. The treasure, cursed and shimmering, had not been given by accident. Its glittering allure had been their bait, cast into the river of mortal ambition. And as they watched the humans clamor for its possession, they neither encouraged nor restrained. They merely waited. There was something cruel in their quiet detachment. When Siegfried fell, struck down by treachery, they did not mourn. His death, though heartbreaking to those who loved him, was just another chapter to the gods, a page in a story they would forget as easily as they had written it. Kriemhild's grief, her descent into vengeance, was not met with pity. To the gods, her pain was an ember in the fire of fate, a spark that would ignite the tragedy to come. But their power was undeniable. Though they did not interfere openly, their presence was felt in the shadows. It was in the glint of steel as Hagen's blade struck, and the weight of Gunther's hesitation, and the unrelenting tide of Kriemhild's wrath. Their influence seeped into every moment, subtle but inescapable, as though the very air carried their will. And yet, for all their power, they remained cold, distant, untouchable. Perhaps the most agonizing truth was that they did not care. Mortals, in their suffering, often cried out to the heavens, seeking answers, pleading for intervention. But the gods offered none. They stood apart, observing the chaos they had seeded with the same detachment a painter might feel for a canvas. They created, but they did not nurture. They ruled, but they did not protect. Their power was vast, but it lacked the warmth of mercy or the fire of passion. It was as if they existed only to remind mortals of their insignificance. And yet, the mortals kept looking upward, searching for meaning in the stars. They spoke of the gods as though they were saviors, as though their silence was wisdom and their absence was a test. Even as tragedy struck again and again, even as blood soaked the earth and hearts broke under the weight of loss, the belief persisted. Perhaps it was easier to think the gods had a plan, that the pain was purposeful, than to accept the stark truth: the gods did not intervene because they did not need to. They had already set the wheel in motion. When the curse of the treasure took root, spreading like a poison through the hearts of all who touched it, the gods remained silent. They had given it its power, its ability to corrupt, but they did not guide its path. It was not their curse to bear, it was humanity's. And as the treasure brought ruin, as it turned love into hatred and loyalty into betrayal, the gods watched without judgment. To them, it was merely the nature of things. And yet, in their indifference, there was a strange and terrible wisdom. The gods did not intervene because they understood something mortals could not: suffering was part of the design. Without it, there could be no love, no joy, no triumph. Without the curse, there would be no redemption. Without betrayal, there would be no loyalty to measure against it. The gods, in their cold detachment, saw the balance that mortals could not. They understood that the story needed its shadows, its pain, its moments of unbearable grief, to give its moments of light their meaning. But for those who lived the story, the gods' silence was an unforgivable cruelty. As the Burgundians fell, one by one, their cries went unanswered. As Kriemhild's vengeance consumed her, there was no divine hand to stop her descent. And when the saga reached its bloody end, when the Rhine swallowed the cursed treasure once more, the gods remained silent still. They had set the stage, and now they let it burn. And yet, the mortals endured. Even in the face of the gods' indifference, they clung to their humanity. They loved fiercely, fought bravely, and mourned deeply. They made their choices, for better or worse, and bore the weight of their actions. In their suffering, there was a defiance, a refusal to let the gods' apathy define them. They might be pawns in a game they did not understand, but they were not without power. They had their hearts, their wills, their courage. And though the gods may have watched with indifference, they could not take that away. The gods, for all their power, could not understand the depth of mortal emotion. They could not feel the sting of betrayal or the warmth of love. They could not weep for what was lost or rejoice for what was found. They could only watch, detached and eternal, as the mortals lived and died, loved and hated, triumphed and fell. And perhaps, in their indifference, there was a hint of envy, a longing for the fire that burned so brightly in those they watched from afar. As the story wove its way through the hearts of those who heard it, the gods remained ever present, their influence undeniable, but their purpose inscrutable. They were there, in every choice and every consequence, shaping the tale even as they stood apart from it. And though they offered no answers, no solace, they left behind something even more powerful, the reminder that the story was not theirs alone. It belonged to the mortals who lived it, who gave it its heart and its soul. The gods may have been indifferent, but the mortals were not. And in that, there was a kind of victory, a defiance that echoed louder than any divine decree. For in their suffering, in their love, in their choices, the mortals proved something the gods could never deny, that even in the face of indifference, life was worth living, and stories were worth telling.